This is the nameless protagonist. I'd like to thank you guys for joining me. Go ahead and get started pretty soon. I'm going to let a few more people come in when they're able to. I definitely want to send some acknowledgments to the few who are here now. Appreciate you being here. VJ, I thank you. Os. War Child Games. Os. The #1 grinder. Os. Toya. I see you. Os. Aria. Os. McDrama Bear. Os. Lavaris M. Glad you can make it, fam. Os. I guess you guys can see the topic in the description here. It's very shortly outlined today, but I think I've got a lot to say on part 4, more than what I thought I would. And it's so much I want to say about, well, really part 3, so much I really want to say about it. It may even overtake the stream today, and I don't mean for it to, but I think in coming of light of the actual scope of the numbers that we're talking about with regards to some of the data I've uncovered, it's something I want to get off my chest today. And it does feed into why I want to push today's topic and make it kind of definitive to really explain why I use this word os, and really in general dojo etiquette and its benefit for the space, especially if you're in the Edo social complex with the Y chromosome, especially. And we'll definitely cover a lot of these things throughout this live stream. But I'm going to wait for a few more people to come in, and then we'll get started with the intro and kick forward with part 1. But we got Vernon King in here. Os. Sigma Jones, one of the Black Ronin. Appreciate you, fam. Os. Oh, Aria, I didn't forget what you said. I'll probably be on next week, so keep an eye out on your chat for that later on. I'll definitely be on next week. I got to take care of some other things and some other spots first, but once I get that squared away, I'll definitely be on more. Stand by one more moment and we'll get started in just a second. But how's everybody doing so far? No, it's been a pretty interesting weekend. And Aria, you do play on Alliance, right? Just so I'm aware. Most of mine are on Horde, but I just want to double check. But we got Smitty that came through. Os. My weekend's going well, fam. It's going pretty well. I was able to get a lot of work done conceptually on the concept of the nameless path. And I keep talking about it, and I really can't wait to really start rolling out a lot more of that information, because I've got a lot of people who kind of know a little bit about it in the background. They've been really encouraging me to really put some of that forward because they think it'll be useful for folks. So I can't wait to see how that rolls out in the space. And in a way, it kind of ties into what we're talking about as well when we get into, mortality rates. We'll definitely be covering that. I think lifestyles definitely leading cause of death when the dust settles. All right, bet, Aria. Appreciate that. Let's see. Got Lovelina. Glad you could make it. Os. D. Scott's here. Os. All right. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Got a nice group here. So, first and foremost, I'm the nameless protagonist. We'll go ahead and begin the initiation with the opening, starting with an acknowledgement to the founders of the space, to those who are present now, and those who will be present in the playback, to those who are here in the dojo. Os, I'm glad you could make it. We're going to be covering this word, Osu No Seishin, or the spirit of Os. Why I advocated for it in the space, and how it can be useful in your everyday life in general. I think this word carries with it a very interesting history. Specifically, when we put it in the context of what I like to classify as dojo etiquette. It is comprised of generally two separate words. The first word being oshi, which stands for, in general, the ability to inspire or endure, mainly to endure, but more specifically in the context of driving forward. It's a direction of energy. The connotation of the kanji itself that it represents is direction of energy, or what we would call a drive. I think some people translate it as push, and it can represent that, to push. But in English, when we use this term, because push can really mean a lot of different things, for us, I think it's probably better to describe it as drive, and specifically in a vector of being given direction and energy to move forward. There is a kinetic component with this that has an internal sense of origin. And I think that's what makes this very unique with regards to how it applies to this term, os, as it's used in oshi. The second part of this kanji, shinobu. This kanji means a lot to me. And it means a lot to me because it forms the kanji that's used to describe this term ninja. It uses the exact same kanji, shinobu. It also is comprised of two different kanji, one for the heart, shinzo, and the other for blade, yaiba. And when you comprise the two together, you've got the kanji for the heart, which is below, and the kanji for the blade, which is on top. And there is a lot of esoteric significance behind the concept of one's heart being pressed to the blade, the elements that they represent, and their relationship to the human psyche and the relationship it has with the mind and the body. Together, they form this term, this word, this concept, to endure. Shinobu. Or if you read it in the actual way or the Nihon style reading, ninja. When you combine those two words together, oishi and shinobu, you get the kanji that's represented for os. I really want to quote. I want to quote an individual who comes from the concept of, or the martial discipline of Kyokushin karate. And I think it'll be good to get into the history of Kyokushin shortly and really break down what makes karate unique in reference to Japan and in reference to how this word os is used and how it differs from the way a lot of people in mainland Japan like using that word, and why there's so much controversy behind it, and why it gained so much traction in dojo culture, which was brought back to the United States from soldiers who were stationed in Okinawa, which was the birthplace of karate. But as a fourth Dan describes back in the 80s, when questioned about this word os, he states in quote, of 10,000 meanings, os expresses the willingness to strive against all odds, to preserve on the road to mental, physical, and spiritual strength, and a resolute communication of respect to one's seniors and responsibility to one's juniors. In a word, this is os, end quote. And to me, that's all that needs to be said. That's all that needs to be said. It is literally able to linguistically cover and represent greetings, acknowledgments, to respond to orders, to give orders. It has a charge when responding to an individual that is your senior, someone that's older than you, an elder, someone that is just simply your senior with regards to a task. In Japanese, they have this idea of senpai and kohai. If some of you are more familiar with a lot of the anime tropes that really push that forward, it is a general respect of the idea of mentorship. And this was first really introduced in the warrior culture. But once more, the warrior culture, because it was so closely tied to the feudal culture, when the industrialization came in for Japan, this was carried over into the work ethic. And so from the dojo culture, from the warrior culture, it made its way into the business culture and then turned into the school systems. And this is where you get this general respect for social order with regards to the in-group. And I'm going to continue to harpoon on this point right here, that I believe fundamentally within the Edo social complex, we need to build a solidarity with us being our own in-group, because none of us chose this classification of Black. It was forced on us. None of us chose our histories, but we're still being held liable for it. We are still experiencing the downsides of being in a group, but we're not tapping into the advantages that being in a group has. And if we're going to have to pay the cost of being in this group, it only benefits us to start taking advantage of what you can do by being your own in-group. Later on, I'm going to speak on intrinsic value, because I think that is a very, very, very important key dynamic that is just utterly missing. And we'll cover that too. But with this word os, to simultaneously acknowledge and respect your seniors and simultaneously recognize the responsibility that you have to your juniors, that instantly puts you in a placement within the group aggregate. And I'm going to say this right now. If we don't do it, nobody else is. And if we don't do it in this environment that's been forged by the founders to do precisely that, irrespective of your differences that you hold for them, if we don't hold that standard to ourselves, nobody will. This is too easy to do. You don't have to agree, but at a fundamental core recognition, understand, respect the senior, at least for the position, and hold a sense of responsibility to know that you at least serve as an example for the juniors. That orientation will take you so much farther because you are already paying the negative consequences for it. It's no different than you paying for a gym subscription that you're not using. It's coming out your account every single check. You might as well take advantage of the benefits of it. And this is one of several of them. things get much easier when you have an aggregate to get certain things done that you're used to doing all by yourself, especially when we come from a group like ours that is so used to doing things on our own. When you can use that currency of trust to at least know that the person next to you has a vested stake and a vested interest, at least while we're online, while we're in this social environment we call the manosphere, specifically the Black manosphere, at least while we're here, maintain that etiquette. Keep that in the back of your mind. And I promise you, the amount of positive energy that feedback loops back to you will give you momentum and inertia to get much more constructed with way less effort on your part. Way less. To persevere, to push, to move forward, to inspire. That is the spirit of Osu No Seishin, the spirit of Os. And while I'll keep using it, and I will keep pushing it, and I will keep moving forward with this idea, because I truly believe this is already something intrinsic within us, which is why when we get exposed to this, especially at an early age, we take to that mess and run with it. We're already wired for it. It's my predisposition to use your predisposition to your advantage, because it is definitely something you're already paying for. I use this axiom: any ritual that you don't take conscious control over will end up taking subconscious control over you instead. So if these are already rituals that we kind of have in place, take advantage of the momentum. But I said a lot here, and we had a lot of people that came in, so we can take a moment to pause. And if you guys have any questions on what I said so far, definitely say something. Let me know, and I can elaborate and go a little bit further. But we'll acknowledge a couple folks that came in. May have got him before, but I'll get you again. Shango Zulu. Os, I see you, fam. We have BGS Ipmore, one of the founders. Appreciate you being here today, sir. Os. We got Dar. Os. Glad to see you again, fam. Glad you can make it. Thanks for the subscription as well. I appreciate that. I should link that so folks can catch some of that. I may repeat some of the things I talked about a little bit later last night, but we'll see. We've got Red Lion here. Os, glad to see you, fam. Glad you could make it. We've got KP from 5C. Always good to see you, family. Os. JBA, I see you again, family. Thanks for the support. Os. Black Uru Strikes. Another one of the elders in the space. Appreciate you, fam. Os. And Kimosabe. Hope things are going well for you. Kenshan. It's good to see you again, fam. Os. Dardar says, create a group within the group. Indeed, fam. It's why I went to great extent to, when I began working on the nameless word kata and pushed forward the concept of the first form being rooted in social dominance order. I think that addresses so many fundamental issues we have within our demographic, to where we are a forced classification that doesn't identify themselves as being a group. And we suffer so much from failing to understand the interpersonal mechanics that are involved with that, and how it trickles out to so many problems we're having, and why solutions that other people present work for them, but fundamentally fail with us, monumentally fail with us, especially if you have a Y chromosome, due to, again, outgroup male subordination. Got Zach Stewart here. Glad you can make it. Os. KP, thanks for the site. Yeah, definitely, you guys, the support definitely helps. Even if you can't contribute anything, a like and a subscribe goes a very long way. And don't hesitate to sign off in the comment section whenever these things go up, or any of the other content that is in the playlist that I have on the site. I definitely appreciate all the comments. I read all of them, and your feedback is important to me. It helps me to kind of help calibrate where everybody's at in the conversation, and it helps me to understand what kind of content I can push forward into the future that you guys may be interested in, that you can find value out of. I'm definitely aiming to work with both regards. So don't hesitate to comment, like, and share, and subscribe. Got Trey here. Says peace. Os. Glad you can make it, fam. Electrician 480. Greetings to you too, friend. Os. Said the worst thing they ever did to us was take away our ability to define ourselves. Something I think that people take for granted because it's part of a default of being human. Because everybody has an understanding of where they came from. And when that's the default, when that serves as a psychological foundation, it's given. It's like being able to breathe air. The fact that you can have a group of people not have that and still function somehow speaks volumes, in my opinion. Lovelina, anytime, family, anytime. But I'll make a little bit of a transition to really get into some of the meat and bones of what this dojo etiquette is. Let me see real quick what Varus was saying. He says, would you say the energy you spoke about earlier is the same as chi in Chinese or ka in Egypt? I need you to give me just a little bit more detail on what you mean by that. What point of energy were you referencing? And hold that question, and I'll revisit that once you've kind of fleshed out, what you mean by that. But dojo etiquette. I like the concept of the dojo as it's understood in this ideology understood as Budo, or the warrior arts. Budo is the concept that sprouted from the amalgamation of the warrior culture in Japan after it had been essentially gutted and neutered for the most part and censored aggressively by Western powers at the conclusion of World War II. If you study Japan's history and learn about the Meiji era, which preceded its industrialization, the way in which it industrialized was unprecedented at the speed at which it did so and what it was able to do, primarily because it took the American model and superimposed itself on its own feudal system that it was using with samurai ideology. It abolished the feudal system, implemented radical democracy, had the imperial power step in front as a figurehead, and had a democratic senate essentially running everything with regards towards the way the country was ran. And former samurai families took the forefront to become the new frontholds for the business model that was used. And this is where we get a lot of the condensation of the warrior culture put front and center. At the conclusion of the Second World War, that was one of the first things that was being sought to remove. It was one of the first things that was seen as a threat because there was a general policy that violence would no longer be a modality that world powers would use to solve issues that helped to form the United Nations as we understand it now. And part of that agreement in Japan's surrender is that it would forfeit its right to a global military, a military entity. outside of the scope of self-defense. And so there was a kind of cultural neutering that took place where anything that made reference to the old warrior culture had to be toned down and disguised. It had to be dialed back in a sense and presented in a non-threatening way. And the general theme behind it all became this concept of making it into more so of a sport. It's how you get modern day Kendo or the swordsmanship style. It's how you get a lot of the modern day martial techniques, especially certain dynamics like karate, which we will get into right now. Because karate isn't an indigenous martial system to Japan. A lot of people think that because a lot of the verbiage and a lot of the placement and some of the cultural dynamics behind karate are Japanese due to it being painted in Japanese with regards to its motif. In truth, it is Okinawan, those islands that are in the southern part of Japan, which for the majority of its existence shared a dual cultural identity with China. What a lot of people don't know is at a certain time of the year, the islands that lead from Okinawa into mainstream East Asia, the distance between these chains of islands and the amount of land that's exposed between them sinks to be so low that you can actually hop from island to island from China, from island to island. And within a space of less than a day's worth of travel, you can make your way from China to Japan and be on land every single day. This is actually how a lot of those migrations happened as Japan was forming its understanding and its identity. And we'll go a little bit back and focus on Okinawa before we move forward into what becomes karate. A lot of the martial sciences from China melded with the indigenous fighting systems that were in Okinawa at the time. I'm going to say starting in the era of the samurai, which was around 1000 AD. We'll start there. And for the longest time, there was just this fusion between Japanese traditional fighting technique and Chinese fighting modalities. And a lot of the would-be samurai in the South distinguished their fighting style off the strength of that. However, Okinawa still maintained its own measure of sovereignty, so much so that it had its own king. It was not part of mainland Japan, but it did have the cultural influence from that time, and trade was very active from that point forward. However, in the 1600s, there was an initiative to disarm all entities that weren't part of mainland. Well, really the mainland. We're talking about the Edo period at this point, the Tokugawa regime. They pretty much were a police state. And at the time, even though Okinawa had open trade with China, they pretty much did a silent takeover of Okinawa and didn't tell anybody. They made it seem like Okinawa was still its own sovereignty, but they replaced the king and pretty much said, look, either we fully invade you and you get deleted off the map, or you adhere to these terms and we let you do business as usual. And pretty much that's what ended up happening. Japan did a silent takeover of the Okinawan islands, didn't tell China, and hid the fact that it was pretty much a Japanese territory. It was annexed. And that was interesting because at that time period, the samurai class was being obliterated. And as a result, or rather the modality that individuals could protect themselves, especially with regards to being able to have open weapons such as the katana and wakizashi, were being obliterated. And the class or caste of samurai was being restricted to a very small percentage of the population and being held under very tight regard. And so there were very few samurai in Okinawa that were able to maintain their presence. And most of them that were there were from mainland Japan at that point, which meant the majority of the population could no longer really defend themselves in the traditional sense that they're used to. This leads us to a time period where they had to hide their knowledge of martial science and adopt it in a way that's very interesting, that becomes very characteristic of what becomes karate in the future. Since they couldn't use traditional weapons, and on those islands, predominantly, the main imports, or rather the main exports, were fish and rice. Many of these individuals were farmers. And so by day, they had to use everyday common items that could double over as a modality of defense. This is where you get a lot of these interesting weapons where you get tools that are used to beat flour. They actually form the foundations of what become nunchaku in the future. Tools that are used to help subjugate wheat. That's where you get the sai. The items that are implemented to cut grain to form other things like udon and other forms of grains used for noodles and whatnot. The kama. The pieces of the hoe to help address the land. Obviously, the bow staff and other implements associated with it. You've even got concepts like the kunai, which formed from tools that were used to help dig up the earth. If you don't know what a kunai is, if you're familiar with the Naruto series, you probably know what that looks like. But it's something that appears to be like a gardening shovel that has a handle on it. And instead of it having a curve that lets you scoop, it looks more straight edged. Oftentimes you see them thrown and you see a lot of ninja utilizing it, but it was a very popular gardening tool that was utilized primarily in Okinawa at first, but oftentimes so that they could defend themselves against individuals, they would sometimes sharpen them and they could double over as tools. There's this interesting culture of duality that takes place. And all of these tools get used as a means of practical application in everyday life and then defense, as well as a cultivation of those unarmed hand techniques that at first were deemed to be too dangerous to teach to everybody, but had to be taught in secret. Because if people knew you had the ability to do that, you were and would be treated as a weapon, and in turn, subjugated as such. And so a tool to help hide and pass on some of these dynamics was the idea of kata. Kata. And people wonder where the origin of this word kata comes from and why I call the system I'm trying to teach word katas. It was born in the spirit of this idea. To get specific, and I guess this is transitioning into point 2. This word kata is formed from 3 separate words that form an interesting kanji. It starts first with this word katachi, or to shape. You form this word by adding the word kai, which stands for cut, and suchi, which means soil or earth. And so when you put all of it together, it's katachi kai suchi, and when it's all combined, it reduces itself to this term kata, or to shape and cut the earth. And there's an interesting relationship that has metaphorically to what's actually happening when you do kata. By definition, kata are a form of physically preserving techniques the same way you would use oral tradition to codify a story or a history or a modality of something or some sort of information that needs to be preserved. Kata, in this sense, was a physical way of preserving information with regards to these fundamental techniques that need to be preserved and handed down. That gets into the concept of Kihon, or fundamentals and foundations, movements that are critical towards progressing and moving forward into the idea of having these martial techniques. I'll get into that in a little bit. Those two feed into each other. But Kata, they were effectively secret techniques that could be catalyzed or served as a catalog and hidden in a form of set sequential movements like a dance, so that you can practice these things in plain sight, but so that you can emulate a combat situation without necessarily having to be in combat. You can keep the spirit of the techniques that you're practicing in their proper context and apply them in a way that makes sense. They are like the combat drills that many of you in the military have experienced. They became fundamental for passing down the art from generation to generation under the nose of Japanese authorities. And for over 250 years during the Edo period, that's exactly what they did. They were able to continue to cultivate devastating techniques. Aquateki, he made a statement here, and I want to highlight that. When it comes up on the StreamYards, I'll highlight it. But Aquateki said, there it is. Almost like capoeira. Aquateki is exactly like capoeira. And what's interesting is, at the time this is going on in Japan, it's the same time this is actually happening in Brazil as well. The quilombos out there in Brazil, or what we would call the maroon population, would sometimes infiltrate onto the plantation and teach some of these techniques. But a lot of them were techniques that were already brought with folks that came over from the continent, specifically Angola. A lot of those fundamental movements were observed by looking at zebras when they were going through their ritual combat for mating and other modalities. A lot of it was inspired by observing nature. It's a pattern you see a lot, and folks in China get credited for that, but there are a lot of indigenous African martial sciences and what people would understand as Mantu arts that were inspired from observing nature, especially the animals that are present there and the elemental forces that animate them. I think that is a fundamental dynamic that gets overlooked a lot of times, and that can be another topic that we can visit in the very near future. But good observation, Aquateki. That is exactly what was going on. And as they hid those movements in the form of dance, Kata is in that exact same spirit. To really finish off the history of karate as we understand it, when the Edo period ended and the Meiji era and the industrialization of Japan took place, these arts were brought to the forefront. And the Chinese origin of these arts were very well known. It was called initially the Chinese hand, and this was just a matter of factual reference. It was a modality of fighting that had its origin in China, and it was techniques and sequences of movements that were brought back from most likely areas of training that originated in Shaolin, most of which being probably Southern styles. So if you're familiar with Wing Chun, a lot of those stances and concepts behind the horse stance, they didn't originate in Japan. Most of those techniques were fundamental foundational movements that were very integral in Southern Chinese martial styles. But as Japan began to form more of an industrial or an imperial power, it wasn't in the best of terms with China. Any of you familiar with Japanese history know that around this time, there was that whole invasion in the creation of a false state called Manchuria. And and attempted colonization of China. So it was during this time period that it went from the Chinese hand to the empty hand. And that empty hand, naming it that way, changing that kanji, allowed for karate to gain its name and context that it has now, the way of the empty hand. And it was so profound, its effectiveness, when they began to find individuals to draft into the militaries that were now forming. Because at first, only those who were born into the military class of samurai could actually be true warriors employed by the state, outside of the exception of ashigari, or foot soldiers who were conscripted from the population. One of the main differences when Japan began industrializing was this universal idea of all men qualifying irrespective of what class you belong to prior. They noticed a pattern that the men from Okinawa who conscripted, who joined the military, had a decided advantage. They had a decided distinct physicality and a decided adaptivity to martial science than everybody else from the mainland. They wanted to know what that was, and ultimately it was karate. And there are different schools that originate from this dynamic, or what they call ryu. And the problem that they were having in Okinawa was just a conflict of personalities amongst them. They couldn't really organize and form kind of a federation until much, 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 much later after World War II. But it didn't stop Japan's interest in trying to cultivate the style, the techniques. And they started finding ways in about 1901 to implement that within the main school curriculum for children. But in order to do that, because of the inherent power and destructiveness within karate, they had to find a way of changing it. And what they decided to do was make adjustments to the kata. This is why within the kata, the lessons that are taught within it, the movements themselves, were in a way swapped out. Movements that involved striking with open hands, spear hands, open palms, different sorts of fists that people are used to seeing within Shaolin styles, the dragon claw, the eagle claw, the panther claw, all of these things existed within karate. There actually weren't really blocks. They were just other modalities of attack. If you're familiar with the Chinese style of iron body, this principle was employed within karate from the onset. In fact, the Kihon, or foundational training, was meant to train you over time to develop a physicality that was so profound that when you employed a block, in quote, it was actually an attack, because your opponent would literally break themselves on your own forearms, because you've strengthened your bones to a point where they can become weapons. And so these strikes, in quote, blocks, were attacks. They could break bamboo armor. They could break armor that samurai were wearing. They could bend metal. They could shatter wood. And a lot of the 60s renditions of it, when people went back to this stage of karate, the way it was pre-neutering, you could see these demonstrations of strength. But in 1901, they needed to teach this and roll this out to the general population. And the idea was, if they roll this out to elementary school children, it can serve as a general benefit to the people. And so they had to change the way it was presented, and it started with the kata. So instead of all of these open hand strike techniques that went from one strike to the next, instead, they closed the fist and they created ideas in terms like high block, middle block, low block. And even though it was the trappings of what was karate, it was what they defined as child's karate, or a kind of muted form of karate that gave you some of the physical conditioning. It gave you a lot of the surface level benefits, but it excluded a lot of the lessons that were being taught within the kata themselves. It's interesting. So you've got children learning these baseline forms. They're learning the footwork, they're learning the posture, they're learning the stance, they're doing the horseback riding stance, they're doing the reverse punches, they're doing the high block, middle block, low block. They're learning some of these other techniques. And this forms what most of the modern world going forward understands as karate. And it's interesting to kind of digress and fast forward to the present moment. The overwhelming majority of what people learn now is this karate that was created in 1901, with the intention of providing a sort of recreational, psychological, beneficial dynamic that wasn't truly rooted in the real combat dynamics of karate, of real karate. That was reserved for people who reached the ranks of Dan, or who could reach the respect and appreciation of the instructors teaching these arts. It would be the adults that were learning the true open hand styles, that learned the meaning, this term I like using a lot, the meanings behind the movements. It's when you learn that that high block, middle block, and low block wasn't actually a high block, middle block, or low block. That was a high strike. That was a middle interception. That was a low parry. That was a grapple. That was a grab. That was a tendon sever. When you learn these dynamics, the whole reason why you do the Kihon, the foundational work to build that tendon strength, to build that bone density through repeated actions over and over again, repeatedly slamming your fist into harder and harder substances. It was after years of cultivating that you could make use of these dynamics. You do simple things like have you grip empty jars forever. One, while you're in horseback riding stance, and having a jar gripped like an eagle claw, like those claw machines that you can grab dolls with. You gripping the lip of a jar like this on either side for hours. And eventually you learn how to do that, and you fill it with water. Then you fill it with sand. Then you fill it with ball bearings. Eventually, after a while, your grip is so profound and you've got so much compound strength that you can literally rip people's muscles off. This was the intention behind that. And this is the modality that Kihon taught. Appreciate that. We got some nonsense in the chat. I think we got that squared away. There's a hidden fundamental to kata that I want to highlight before I move on to the next point that I find profoundly interesting. And I think they apply. I'm going to say they do apply. Because if you haven't drawn the parallels, when I speak about the nameless word kata and all of the principles that are involved behind them all, they are a form of combat. It's just that combat can take place not just physically, but mentally. And in fact, they happen mentally first. And so when you engage in dialogue, so long as another individual that's a human being is involved in the process, the same process applies here. There's a hidden lesson taught within kata. And it's this dynamic of the element of breathing. It is so profound to be taught in kata with this regard that part of knowing you have a good instructor, a good sensei, a good teacher, is whether or not they are emphasizing this aspect of breathing while you're doing the kata. There are three fundamental aspects of breathing when implementing the use of kata. They are ibuki, nogare, and kiai. Ibuki, nogare, and kiai. They are effectively describing tempo, the internal and external strength of your breath, and the control of your breath. I like comparing it to the phenomenon of lightning. Ibuki, which represents the internal and external strength of your breathing, is much like the way it's compared to inyo. Inyo in Japanese is the Japanese way of pronouncing yin yang, darkness and light. The positive, negative, the rising and descending. You can equate this to the inhalation and the exhalation. When you perform a movement within one step of a kata, when you make that move, there is an inhale portion to that. That is the yang. You are drawing in, consuming, growing. Then there's an exhale. That exhale represents the yin, the exhalation, the explanation, the deflation, the sinking. This is where you draw your force. Depending on where you are at in this pattern, will determine whether or not your force, your technique actually has real strength behind it. I think the martial science of Tai Chi Chuan goes a long way to emphasize that first and foremost. Every movement you do, every step of Tai Chi Chuan, every movement left and right, the rising, the sinking, it's animated by the breath. And whether or not you're in a rising or lowering breath depends or determines the outcome of the energy of that physical act you're doing. It is, in truth, where you get your power from with your technique, or what they call waza. This is ibuki. I compare this concept of ibuki to the actual lightning within the phenomenon of experiencing lightning in the sky. That is the essence of power. That is the energy, or as we described in sword form, or the word kata 6 or 5, with the difference between force and power. That would be the force. The force, the lightning itself, this is ibuki. Understanding the internal and external dilation and modulation of strength and power. This word shikara is often used to describe ibuki. That strength, that power, that strength of lightning. That is ibuki. Nogare. Nogare is more so like the power. It is the light that's produced from the lightning. The power, or rather the lightning itself, happens so quickly you don't see it. Not until it's already gone. But that residue, that aspect that lets you know it's there, that ever-present power, is nogare. It is what is classified as combat breathing. And it is a way of slowing things down and gaining control of a tempo. It is a constant, steady release of energy that sets the entire tone and brings extremes into balance with each other. It is in music what is understood as the metronome. It's what sets the modulation and the tone of any scenario that you're in conflict. It's what keeps you from running out of breath, and it keeps you from staggering on your own breath. It shows you how to get out of your own way. It fundamentally is the definition of balance. Without that, the amount of energy you lose in a fight is so profound that even on a physiological level, if you can maintain this idea, this spirit of nogare, of calmness all throughout, even tempoed, not too much, not too little, straightforward the whole way, then the amount of energy at your disposal is profoundly higher. Your neurology actually slows down. The vagus nerve doesn't send fight or flight hormones at the same degree. You can actually maintain control and concentration. And it's that loss of concentration that oftentimes spells the end of the fight for you. It takes away resources that your mind could use to identify potential openings, to identify information in a constant changing conflict or field of conflict, so that you can employ your technique properly. With this nogare and calm breathing, the steady metronome, you can employ all your techniques with ease, and in turn translate all of that power to see the openings that your opponents present themselves. This can be experienced in combat, on a physical, on a mental, and even in everyday life and conversation. When you're on panels speaking with people, it can get frustrating. But when you can control your breathing, when you have control of that constant water over a duck's back, breathe in, breathe out, focus on breathing. Every step has its own pace and tempo. If you let that become an automatic dynamic and don't allow yourself to have an overly spirit or overly abundant spirit or a too depleted spirit, that middle ground, that is nogare. That's the ideal to aim for. That is the light produced from the lightning strike. And this last one, for anybody that's done any form of martial arts, you're very familiar with this. For those that did the Korean arts, you've heard this as kyup. For those who do more of the Japanese style or other styles that are derivative from that, you understand this concept of kiai. Kiai is the thunder that results in the phenomenon of a lightning strike. It is the absolute expression of that energy as it resolves itself, especially in the form of a strike, especially when you are demonstrating the flow of energy from its inception in the void, its expression in action, and its conclusion. Kiai is the thunder. It's instant. It is a flow. It happens all by itself. There's the technique and there's your kiai. And within it, it's like the sound of a clap. There's no space between it. It happens all at once. It's the result of proper execution of technique and center within the breath. The kata, especially at the beginning and especially at the end, that's emphasized. It is a conclusion to the rising and falling action, and it completes the technique. It gives you that follow through that's required for you to get an objective achieved. In a word, it's very closely related to this mind state understood as zanshin. And we can get into the different mind states a little bit later, probably on another live stream, because this could go on for a very long time. But it's very closely related to that. And it is an integral part of kata for that reason. It, in combination with everything else, is the true lesson of the cultivation and flow of energy through oneself that kata teaches you. It is absolutely important. And without that aspect of breath, I don't think you really have kata as it's understood. I wanted to introduce this concept because there are many examples that you can find in your everyday life where these things play important roles, whether it be on panels, whether it be in your job, whether it be with addressing family members, people that are in your home. Maintaining that composure by keeping that fundamental energy within you that is represented by your breath. That is what that word chi actually means. That's the core of it, your literal breath. And when you can maintain an understanding of that flow and have it become one with your intention, that is how you can proceed in the direction and the implementation of force and power. Your breath. No breath, no power. No breath, no power. The last component to these modalities that are present within Kata and karate in general and dojo culture is the Kumite. And that stands as the application of technique in a context under which it was designed for. And I will fast forward to bringing us to the present moment with karate as we understand it now, and why these three components were brought up in this idea of Budo, which now accompanies it in the modern era. When Japan was defeated and the West was finding ways of disarming Japan, it went out of its way to have to try to hide these things once again. And it wouldn't be until later on in the 50s and the early 60s that there was this drive to reconstruct the old way of martial science. Sensei Oyama, who ultimately created the idea of Kyokushin karate, he took the two presiding schools of Gojo-ryu and Shotokan and combined the two to form this idea. He went out into the wilderness and for years trained in nature to cultivate his technique all over again, using the foundations that was set before him, emphasizing this idea of Kihon, these fundamentals. He was at the waterfalls, understanding the element of water. He literally was breaking minerals, the earth, wood, rocks with his bare hands. He cultivated the dynamic of fire, literally conditioning his limbs by stepping over hot coals, understanding the aspects of air by cultivating that inner energy, by mastering the breath through meditation. All of these things form a martial dynamic we call the Godai, or the five elements, with the last one being the void. A group of people who practice this known as Shugindo. If this sounds familiar for ninjutsu, this is the exact same dynamic. This ideology is what pushed karate to the next level. Kyokushin is one of the fundamental dynamics that put karate in a true state of notoriety and notability. And a small little bit of trivia. The character you know from Street Fighter known as Ryu, or as we pronounce him in the West, I guess Ryu, he was inspired by this individual. If you get time, definitely look him up. Sensei Oyama. Profound history. He emphasized and revised those three concepts of Kihon, Kata, and Kumite, and introduced them to mainstream Japan, but started in his hometown in Okinawa. Sensei Oyama, exactly, Aquateki. And it's interesting because at this time period, there were a lot of individuals that were stationed in Okinawa, obviously, due to the naval and the Air Force bases that were placed there. And this is where a lot of Americans got exposed to karate during this golden era. And it was his impetus that used this word os to drive the spirit of that Kyokushin ideology, that true way of resolute self-honesty with reality, to push and endure when others would understand when you would give up. A lot of those individuals that were on active duty in Okinawa learned karate under those contexts and brought it back to America. And this is where you've got a lot of Black martial artists that took what they learned from their time overseas in Japan and took it back to the hood where they came from, especially in places like Harlem, DC, certain places in the South, Chicago, definitely Oakland and California. During that late 60s, early 70s time period, when all of this was popping off, you have martial artists showing up everywhere pushing this. And this is an aspect where this term os really became entrenched in the Black martial arts community, especially. This isn't anything new. We've been pushed this. Some interesting modern examples of who practiced this exact same science would be Michael Jai White, if you're familiar with him. He did an excellent movie series. Well, he's been in a lot of stuff, but I think Blood and Bones is one of the main ones he's most noted for. But that particular ryu he studied, Kyokushin, that's exactly what he trains in. There are a lot of us in that warrior culture. And the spirit of Osu No Seishin, pushes that whole dynamic forward, encapsulates that whole idea, embodies that whole concept of dojo culture. And it fosters a warrior culture at its core. Because fundamentally, that's been one of the main things that has been under attack for anybody in the Edo social complex that has a Y chromosome. It's why I advocate for it 125%. And it's why I think it's something we can and must cultivate. Again, that recognition of respect to the elders and the recognition of responsibility to one's juniors. To push and endure against all odds. To persevere mentally, physically, and spiritually. Animated in the spirit of strength. Because it's strength and resilience that provides the fuel you need to actually have courage. And that's the only way you can overcome fear, with courage. Without it, there's absolutely no way you could have compassion. In a nutshell, that is the core reason why I advocate for this word. That's the core reason why I advocate for the use of kata and why the nameless word kata are named precisely as that. If I were to say it, I guess in a usage, it would be nanashi no kata, or the nameless katas, the nameless forms, the nameless word forms. I think each of them and each of these dynamics are important tools that demonstrate their value time and time again. And in this next half, we're going to be getting into some of that when we speak about a bit about the situation that's gone on in Buffalo. And, just some of the details tied to that. But we can definitely pause here. And there's been a ton of people that's come in. So I want to make some acknowledgments and acknowledge some of these cash apps that came in as well. I absolutely appreciate you guys' assistance and participation. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to type them out in the chat. We can definitely go on that while we handle this transition. But let's see, we've got Electrician 480. Os. Miguelito 69. What's going on, fam? Os. Welcome to the channel. Glad you can make it. Let's see, Jordan Zavi. Os. Glad you could make it as well. AB Media. Os. MLR, always a pleasure to see you, family. Greetings. Os. Gino Richardson, what's good, fam? Os. We got Admiral Smoke, aka Gynocratic Garfield. What's good, family? Os. Naking. I think I saw you last night on BGS's stream, man. I'm glad you could make it, fam. Os. We got Drew Main. Okinawan Masters didn't teach them everything. Indeed, they did not. It's a lot of stuff not being put forward, but it's all about networking in that culture. It always has been. It's no different than what's going on in China right now. We got DC fam. What's good? Just greetings from the outer rim. Peace to the chat. Salute to my DMV brother and nameless protagonist. Slow and steady is the way. Balance is paramount. Family indeed. Us. We got hybrid ninjas. Us. Glad you can make it, fam. Black men being brutally honest. Remember the habitual line steppers. I'm glad you can make it, family. Us. Let's see, we got Ankh. Made it here. Us. Kareem Austin. Us. Glad you can make it. He says, yes, if you look up Ryu, they state he's based off him. He is indeed. And with the trailer that came out with Street Fighter 6, that's coming out pretty soon, they really seem to be trying to draw those parallels, those lines to them very overtly. If you look at Sensei Oyama's build and you look at the way Ryu is being presented in Street Fighter 6, they didn't pull any punches trying to draw parallels. They pretty much pulled the Mike Tyson with this one, with what they did with quote Boxer or Balrog as he was called in the Japanese version, or no, they called him Mike Bison in the Japanese version, and they called him Balrog in the Western translation. I wonder if he ever got paid off of that. They definitely took his liking. Anthony Ricks, Akira-san, hisashiburi. Os. Let's see. T Fitness for You says you would do an amazing job talking about Professor Ronald Duncan. You know what? I did a series with Big Duke 24. We had a series where we talked about Forgotten Fury, and we went in on Black martial artists during that time, and we definitely brought up Ronald Duncan and how he pretty much got his thunder stolen from him from Stephen K. Hayes when he was introducing Nimpo to the West, specifically in America. He'd been doing it for a long time, but the issue with media and the magazines, especially Black Belt Magazine at the time, there were tons of black martial artists all over the place, but they were not getting publicity like that at all. And it's kind of unfortunate, but on a positive tip, I guess UFC is going out of its way to sort of correct that now, but maybe that's another conversation for another day. But definitely peep that live stream. I'll see if I can find it. And what I'll do is I'll put it in my playlist in the collaboration tabs. And you can definitely go take a look at that. I think that was a pretty good stream we did. Dada said they did. You couldn't tell me that wasn't a straight rip. Yeah, but I think that was the goal all along. Maybe they kind of pulled a retcon, but he's pretty popular. Sensei Oyama. So do you sort of an archetype at this point? Definitely one of the things that motivated me when I was younger. And salute to Street Fighter. But I will get to some of these cash apps now. Definitely appreciate that. We've got KC that came in with the donation. I appreciate you. Os. Aquateki. Again, I definitely appreciate that, fam. Os. We've got Dardar twice. Fam, I appreciate that. Thank you. Os. And Black Uru. I definitely appreciate that, family. Os. I think that's everybody I see here. Yep. But any questions before we transition a little bit? Because I'm about to do a hard 180. And a little bit of a rant. Because this has been blowing me the way people have kind of talked about this scenario, especially lately. And BGS did a recent video about it, really speaking to the lack of intrinsic value people have held, the lack of recognizing the humanity with certain folks with regards to just death in general. But yeah, I wanted to address a little bit and speak on some fundamental aspects about what happened in Buffalo and its significance in a deeper context. You know, I speak a lot about the first word kata 1, social dominance order. And I emphasize how important it is to understand the way in which human beings organize by hierarchy. A refresher for folks who weren't here for that or haven't seen that. In general, human beings have 3 fundamental ways that they organize themselves. Number 1, age. You don't have toddlers and adolescents running societies. Individuals that are older typically run the society. Number 2, human beings organized by gender. By and large, for the most part, in antiquity, and not even just human beings with this, all mammals across the board essentially organize themselves by virtue of gender. And it's overwhelmingly men that are in charge of the society on a structural level. You've got age, classification 1, gender, classification 2. Then you've got what's understood as arbitrary discrimination as the 3rd category. And this has 2 primary subsets, 2 major spheres of organization: in-group and out-group, each of which has a hemisphere of male, female. I set them in that order for that reason, because there's kind of a hierarchy based on the order that they're presented there. And it's presented that way for that reason. Within the in-group, men essentially are the epicenter of power there. And a lot of their actions are done with the intention of protecting the females within that demographic and classification. Essentially because you don't get more of that in-group unless you have control of that womb within that female classification. In other words, if you don't have women, you don't procreate, you don't have an in-group anymore. You can have one dude and they can get with an infinite number of females, but a woman can only have one child at a time. This is why, in general, the female classification within this dynamic is usually insulated by the male in-group demographic. And in turn, the flow of power usually begins with an impetus within that in-group male classification. What gets interesting is when we talk about the out-group, however, because there's an interesting phenomenon understood as the out-group male subordinate male classification, in that when it comes to the direction of power, those out-group men are disproportionately the recipients of power in a negative context with regards to controlling when it comes to the in-group men directing that energy. In other words, out-group men are always seen as the disproportionate targets of negativity. So much so that oftentimes the females of the out-group can either be ignored or included within the in-group with the purpose of expanding the in-group by definition. This plays out in almost every scenario where human beings organize themselves, whether it be religion, whether it be politics, whether it be any sort of social environment that groups find themselves with. And it's not just human beings that do this. It's all over the animal kingdom. It's been done since the beginning when social groups form groups. So long as that serves as a foundation, that is its core. What's key here, again, if you are not part of that in-group and you do have a Y chromosome, meaning you're male, you essentially will continue to have a target on your back. And that's been proven consistently through implicit association. And if you're not familiar with an implicit association bias, it's really speaking about the fight or flight system that's within your limbic system that identifies friend and foe. This is embedded deep within one's neurology. And I speak about the unique scenario in the United States with race. And It's a big reason why I don't talk about race anymore, especially not as much as I used to. I instead relate it to social dominance order. Because at its core, all races is another deviation of social dominance order. It is in-group, out-group dynamics. And we understand that because we realize that there's two primary classifications within this dynamic of race. There's a definition of white and there's a definition of non-white. Every aspect of race you see globally has some definition of white, period. And it may vary on location and where you go, but it begins with the definition of white. And it's generally not predicated on your genetics. It's predicated on some physical characteristic that you exhibit as a human being, some external phenotype that doesn't exclusively relate even to your ethnicity per se. But what physical characteristics did you manifest that fits that local definition of what's being identified as white? And that particular demographic that identifies themselves as white, they're the ones that set the definition for that. They're the ones that decide who fits that category. And everybody else is some spectrum, some definition, some variation of non-white. And it's important to understand that because there's so many different names for that. These days, the new popular term is person of color. At the end of the day, they're non-white. And that's where the dynamic of in-group, out-group dynamic really, really puts in work and sets its tone. What becomes problematic when this becomes an aspect of national identity is this definition of white has an antithesis to it. This antithesis is generally identified as the definition of black. Everywhere you go, this term black ends up being relative as a result of that, but it's relative to the definition of white there. As a result, this word black ends up being a shadow of the word white. Whatever the definition of white is, it infers the definition of black, which is almost often always some sort of inverse classification, inverse phenotypical comparison to white, which in the terms of race, especially here in North America, it means that black is a forced classification that you don't actually ascribe to. It's something that you're assigned, and it's not anything you have any control over. What makes this even further problematic is the fact that this definition of white has a very simple formula. W plus W equals W. That's the only way you get that. If you take W plus anything else, which we've already identified as NW, you get NW. It doesn't matter what your genetic makeup. It doesn't matter what your parents were. At the end of the day, you are some classification of NW the moment you introduce anything other than a straight W or anybody with that W classification. And what that means is at the end of the day, you are forcing yourself into a demographic corner. If you want a vivid example of that, all you have to do is take a look at Obama. For all intents purposes, he's classified, no matter what you want to say, as NW. And because he has a unique set of classifications or physical characteristics that are antithetical to this definition of W, he's called black, even though he is just as much somebody that's white as well. Damn his genetics, forget his mom. Because he's got some aspect of NW, he inherits the classification of NW, period. That in and of itself, going back to the understanding of social dominance order, means that your in-group is a group that by definition will continually shrink because you can't introduce anybody else to your in-group that doesn't share that classification already. Because those characteristics that are being identified as W, that are being identified as white, in the global context of human beings, happens to be genes and characteristics that are recessive when it comes to what occurs when you mix that formula. And among all peoples in that NW classification, those individuals classified as Black have the greatest potential to overwrite and make recessive those classifications that are defined as white. Therein lies the problem with race in America and it being intimately related to national identity. And it serves as its core of what really motivated the ideology and understanding of what went down in Buffalo. Why, so long as this concept of race exists as it is, I don't know if America is going to be able to continue to keep its definition of what this term means at the moment. I don't think it will be able to realize its potential. I made an observation, and we can talk about this. I'll be talking about this again later on when I get into some other content with some other content creators in the space. But just as a footnote, understand that what makes the United States unique amongst all other countries on Earth is that everybody else on planet Earth in the modern era that's participating in first world industrialism, they were a nation first before they were an industrial entity. And that is absolutely critically important because everybody else adopted their industrial model off of their feudal model that they had prior to that, which was steeped in a national identity. And that's very important because they already hashed out the definition of what it meant to be a participant nationally within that country. In the United States, it began as a modality of business. It was essentially a corporation. Its primary objective before it had any national identity was to produce goods. That's it. That was its sole purpose for existence. That's what the purpose of that colony was for. It doubled over in a certain sense as a penal colony as well, but not to the extent that Australia was forged for that reason. The quote, New World was profitable. And as a result, the energy that animated everything here in its foundations was rooted in industrial capitalism. It was a business before it was a nation. By the time it started to become a nation, we're talking about 1776. And even then, you don't really start getting to really see America as a nation until 1812 when the British stopped trying to take it over, which almost happened several times. So we're really only talking about since 1812 when what's being called America got to actually start being a nation. By then, other places in North America have already been dealt with a lot of their interracial issues if they had one, especially with the differences of philosophy with regards to how to acquire power in dealing with groups of people. The Spaniard and Portuguese, they acquired power through mixing with the populations that they subjugated. And as a result, it allowed for them to fall back on class and caste to rule people. Instead, the British and the French had this idea of not mixing blood. They didn't do that way. And whenever that did occur, it was for the purposes of what Black Ooh said earlier, the creation of buffer classes. Put that statement up there. Buffer classes. That NW dynamic that's given certain privileges over others to keep a dynamic in place. Because the model of the plantation is what was used to fuel the industrial model in the US. Because that was the same feudal model that they were practicing during their feudalism back in Europe. It's the serf model, just revamped and given a racial context instead of a class context, with no real way to become a knight unless you're willing to work for the organization. A lot of times we call them police now. That's not any shade on the police. It's just speaking to the de facto root of how it began as an organization that was organized to guard property. And it's just a simple fact that the human beings participating in that form of industry happened to be property. The cultural inertia was set from a business foundation before it was set in a national identity. The national identity only had one requirement for entry. And at first, it was to be male and a property owner. And eventually that expanded out, especially with the advent of the 13th Amendment, to where eventually all you needed to do was simply be born in this soil. Any soil that's identified as being American territory, now you get the classification of American. The problem is it doesn't address this issue of in-group, out-group preference, specifically in the context of race as it's understood. Because what serves as the foundation of race in this system is the definition of white. And we know that this definition of white can only be decided by individuals that already have that classification. And there is a recessive dynamic that is associated with these classifications, which means they can only reproduce themselves with other individuals who share that classification. And what did I say about the way the in-group generally works? That the men in the in-group protect the females within that in-group because that's the only way they get to perpetuate their in-group. And that goes even more so because it's only through a white female that you're going to get more white people. And if you introduce any other male to that white female, the end result is non-white. And so now we get into the real social dynamics of how race was pushed forward in this context and how social dominance sort of plays out all over again. Outgroup male subordination, or the subordinate outgroup male dynamic being the disproportionate recipient of violence. When you follow this country's history, almost all racially motivated violence, a lot of the institutions that were destroyed, a lot of the instances of hanging and lynching were directly related to an accusation made by a white female against a dude that was classified as black. That fear of having that dynamic put together is so deep that if you look at that movie Birth of a Nation, the one that was done in 1915, it helped inspire the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riots, where because of an accusation of a white female in an elevator full of people, mind you, just the mere accusation of it, word of mouth spread around. Apparently, that got blown out into full-blown sexual assault. And with the images that were presented in that movie, Birth of a Nation, where a white female was being presented as being attacked by some dude that was in blackface depicting a black male, to preserve her sanctity and her purity, this chick jumped off a freaking cliff so she could preserve her dignity, end quote. And the heroes of that movie were the folks in white sheets. For those of you who have not seen this movie before or don't know about it, please look that up, Birth of a Nation. Images go a long way. Because this is what's baked into the cultural inertia of the United States, as much as it keeps getting swept under the rug. And it keeps coming up because it's embedded in this dynamic. And we see it come up over and over and over again, the same way we did in Buffalo. Here's where I'm going with all of this. The definition of terrorism. The definition of terrorism is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. I'm going to say it again. The unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. What happened in Buffalo was animated by that exact spirit, ideology. And what really upsets me is when I hear the language that's being used to describe this. it gets compared to black on black violence. Black on black violence doesn't have an agenda. Black on black violence or proximity violence is something that every race of people experience. The differences between the groups of people is less than 10 percentage points of one another. In other words, this is an aspect of human behavior. Human beings kill people in proximity to where they live at. Period. That's how that operates. That's how that works. And yes, we've got some disturbing statistics with regards to violent death, and I'm going to definitely touch on that. But I think it has a lot more to do with the issue of race as we understand it related to social dominance order, rather than a lot of the nonsense that's being put forward as a means of gaslighting, not talking about this, because it is, by definition, terrorism what took place. He stated very clearly this idea of replacement theory, which really is nothing more than what Dr. Frances Cress Welsing describes in her book, The ISIS Papers, when she describes fear of a black planet and describes racism as white genetic survival. She was spot on. That is exactly what the hell they're talking about. Now, the origins or the true root of what's causing this is utterly and completely mistaken. But it doesn't matter if it fits that narrative, if it fits that idea that we are somehow invaders that are taking and attacking something that they are perceiving and posturing as their own. And they are willing to take an ideology and act upon it. Belief followed by action, some define as a religion. Belief followed by action. I think Dr. Neely Fuller moves with that working definition of religion, and I agree with it. If white supremacy is a religion, then the gynocracy is a cult. And I find it interesting that the gynocracy and white supremacists are the two main individuals that are vested, that have a financial, an economic, a legal, and a political gain and interest in maintaining race as it's understood and perpetuating this status quo, because that is precisely how they gain power. One through the use of violence and intimidation and terrorism, by definition, and the other through coercing resources by virtue of government posturing. It's interesting because the ones that end up suffering at the end of the day still end up being those men in the out group that are the disproportionate recipients of violence. We catch it from both sides, from the white supremacists and from the gynocracy. It is ideology backed by violence to serve a political goal to intimidate. That is terrorism. It is unfortunate that death happens, and death happens to everybody at any given moment. It can occur. But the context under which that death occurs matters in civil society. There's a reason why there's a difference between manslaughter and murder. There's a difference between someone just haphazardly dying, general violence, and premeditated violence with a political agenda. There's a reason why assassination and murder are classified differently. There's a completely different set of rules and political posturing and conditioning that you need to take when you're dealing with individuals that are willing to exercise terrorism. And no, it doesn't have anything to do with you being scared. To compare gang violence, people quote terrorizing the community and trying to make a false equivalence to that, in a calm, directed ideology that believes that we need to be wiped off the freaking planet, let alone anywhere that they live at, purely because of something you were born as, is not the same thing. That dude wrote in his manifesto that the animating reason behind what he did was to intimidate and make clear and give the message that no matter where we go, so long as white people are there, we are not safe. I don't know his words verbatim. Verbatim. That is terrorism. That is not black on black crime. It's not proximity violence. It's not. It is, in so many words, a declaration of war. A war that's been waged pretty much ever since we literally showed up in the lexicon, in the context that we were brought over here as. And it's never really stopped. I'm not saying anything you haven't heard before. Malcolm X has said it over and over again. King said it over and over again. You heard it from the Panthers. You heard it from W.E.B. Du Bois. You heard it from Booker T. You heard it from Garvey. You heard it from the Nation of Islam. You heard it from anybody that talks about these things. It's the damn truth. And the common deflections at this point are just nothing more than intellectual dishonesty. You've got a misunderstanding of numbers, a total misunderstanding of numbers. People need to understand that even though for the majority of folks that are classified as white in this country, even though 99% won't even think about anything like this, they could be vehemently against this idea. All it takes is 1% to hold that ideology, and that's all that's required to actually get something done. 1%. Less than 1%. And let me put this in the context for you. You know, we've got over 300 million people in the United States. Amongst those 300 million, do you know that we've got about roughly just over 1 million people in active duty in the military right now? 1 million. That's about 1/3% of the US population. That's all it takes. Less than 1/3% of the US population to run one of the strongest militaries in global human history. 1/3%. 1/3. How much more so then would it take for 1% of the largest demographic that's here, take 1/3% of them to actually launch action and do something about it and act on it? Take a look at what's going on with the so-called Islamic extremists. It took it is less than a percentage of people that were able to wage war against the strongest military on planet Earth. A bunch of goat herders who are in the middle of nowhere damn near, with nothing but caves and an ideology to fight a technologically superior force for damn near 20 freaking years. That's all it took. A percentage of a group of people to wage war that freaking long. I need people to understand that this isn't about needing some major majority of people like politics. When there's a belief followed by action, it doesn't take a lot of people. It just takes a small, tiny percentage of folks that are willing to act on it. That's what makes terrorism so freaking powerful. That's why we need to take this serious. That's why you can't compare this to black on black crime, proximity violence. They have nothing to do with each other. We're talking about politics, which is the use of power. And what leaves us uniquely ill prepared to deal with this is what we said earlier about ultimately we are a forced classification, a group that we are suffering the consequences of being classified as a group for, but not getting any of the benefits as a result of that because we don't identify ourselves as being in our own in-group. The twisted, jacked up part of it is because there's this national identity of American that only requires you to simply be born here. We identify with this dual cultural dynamic where we see ourselves as being American, but we can't see ourselves being part of this black in-group. So what we behave and the way we treat each other is the same way other in-group men treat us as an out-group. In other words, even though we're part of the same group, whether you want to be or not. We treat each other as though we're part of the out group. And it is a fundamental roadblock in keeping us from being able to get anything done. Because it means that everybody in this country then treats us like out-group subordinate men, including other men that have the classification of Black. That is a problem. That's a problem. I sat here and I looked at these statistics. And let me drop some links. These stats are taken from the CDC. Absolutely and completely just obliterates all his idea that intersectionalism wants to put forward with this mess. That's a link to essentially leading causes of death for Black men in America. And I had to compare this to everybody else. And it just really blew my mind how this breaks down with regards to not our overall causes of death, which is what the first chart shows. That shows all ages in aggregate. But the way this breaks down when you start controlling for age, because people ask, and they want to try to use the shaming context and gaslighting to say that we shouldn't have a right to complain about the situation that happened in Buffalo because where's our army, in quote, for example. I heard someone say some goofiness like that. My first reaction was, okay, well, 20 million abortions since, Roe v. Wade, probably that's step one. Step two, I want you to take a look at this graphic. Age group. Between ages 1 and 19, 5% of our deaths are from homicide. Even when you get into 20 to 44, 26%, still the leading cause of death. Homicide. What did we say in social dominance order? Arbitrary discrimination, that third classification. Men in the out group are the disproportionate recipients of negativity, power, and violence. If we continue to see ourselves as our own out group, it explains this dynamic. It explains it. We see ourselves as an out group and we behave just like that mess because we can't identify with each other on a baseline intrinsic level and see that we have a shared vested interest in the success and the existence of each other. We can't see it. There is a chart I'm trying to find that came from the Department of Justice. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead and read this. And I'm going to put this link in the chat also. You guys definitely hold on to these for your records. This is very important info to just have on hand because the gaslighting is real about all of this. And it's really old. It's really, really old. But this is from the Department of Justice, titled Black on Black Homicide, a Sociological Political Perspective. I'm going to just go ahead and read the whole abstract of this so you can kind of get a piece for what's being said, and I'll highlight certain parts. This is... All right, it starts with the general annotation. It says Black homicide rates are 7 to 8 times those of whites, although Blacks have a rate of poverty of only 4 to 5 times that of whites. And there's definitely an imbalance going on. And there's definitely a correlation to income. It starts, today homicide is the leading cause of death among young Black men and contributes significantly to the shortened lifespan of the Black male. In about 80 to 90% of the cases, the Black victim was killed by another Black. And about 52% of the murder victims were acquainted with their assailant. I'm going to say that last part again. And about 52% of the murder victims were acquainted with their assailant. Just as we accept that suicide victims are psychologically impaired, we must acknowledge that a murderer is similarly impaired, and Blacks, for both environmental and political reasons, are likely to reflect emotional predispositions that allow them to more readily become a homicide statistic. Projected self-hatred facilitates blind rage and gives the perpetrator of the violent attack a sense of legitimacy and justification. I'm drawing these parallels to how these terrorists talk. I'm saying there's a point of origin from this mess. If you don't see yourself as part of your own in-group, you will see yourself as a part of the out-group. And that whole concept leads to you seeing somebody that looks like you as a threat on an intrinsic level. It goes on further. In addition, Blacks have been indoctrinated by a criminal justice system that places higher value on a white life than a Black life. Once again, we're going to repeat that. In addition, Blacks have been indoctrinated by a criminal justice system which places higher value on a white life than a Black life. In-group, out-group preference. All day long. All day long. While psychological study of homicide offenders and victims is difficult and not easily quantifiable, it is important to explore such variables in Black community violence. Programs focused on crime and violence preventions, therefore, must do more than alleviate socioeconomic ills in the Black community. They must also pay attention as well to negative psychological dynamics in the Black experience that contribute to interscene victimization. And that means this term interscene is kind of like, it's mutually detrimental. It's like a self-victimization. It's a compound victimization. The Black community in particular is in dire need of homicide prevention centers with programs of prevention, research, and treatment. In other words, this at the end of the day is showing a distinct lack of the recognition and acknowledgement of the inherent humanity in somebody that has a Y chromosome and they're Black. I wanted to do a separate video on this in particular, but I had to tie this into why this word os is so goddamn important to me and why I keep pushing this to us. Because there's this continued notion that respect and intrinsic value is something that's supposed to be earned. And that is concubine freaking host talk, host speak. That's all that is. That's host speak animated from Briffelt's Law. Gynocratic, gynocentric thinking, if there has ever been something that could be classified as such. Human beings hold intrinsic value because they're human, period. I don't care where they are, what they've done, who they are. Decency and respect for someone being a human being isn't something that needs to be categorized or classified on some meritocracy dynamic. It doesn't mean you own everything. It doesn't mean you're superior to somebody. It means you have value because you are a human being. And what we see practiced in the Edo social complex is a selective perspective and projection of respect and value intrinsically, as long as you don't have a Y chromosome. If you're female, you're given that baseline respect. Case in point, take a look at the goofy nonsense that Shaq said not that long ago about how he treats his daughters versus the way he treats his sons. He holds deep intrinsic value for his daughters. But for his sons, they have to, quote, earn their respect. They have to earn their values. Essentially being human, damn near, it seems like. To the point where he's willing to hand everything to those daughters and just kick the sons out on you and we'll go figure it out. And then everybody wants to wonder why men in the Edo social complex end up being successful, not because of the Edo social complex, but in spite of. Wonder how we have to be masters of force all the damn time and be the 1 with 10 rather than the 10 with 1. And if this is the way we treat our own in-group, how much more so other groups of people who see us as legitimate threats and are willing to exercise and utilize violence as a means of answering things socio-politically. I really want to drive home that point that was made earlier about ages from the ages of 1 through 44. Do you understand these are the productive ages of men? This is your working class men that set the foundation for society in the Black community. And our leading cause of death is homicide, followed immediately by a solid unintentional injuries, which means we're probably dying from things that involve doing work. I want you to understand that when you compare that to the white male demographic, for example, let me put this up here real quick so you can see what I'm talking about. When you compare that same thing to the white male demographic, I really want to drive this point home. Again, this is the CDC. You can just take your time and look through all this stuff. Homicide don't even show up. It shows up at its highest point at 5.4% between ages of 1 and 19. And it's cut in half by the time you get to the ages of 20 and 44 at 2.8%. White men in comparison are dying more from unintentional injuries and suicide. They're killing the damn selves and just rolling the dice on accident, dying more from that. I want to add some context to that numerically. Remember when I said earlier that less than a third of a percentage of this country's population contributes to the military? I want you to take a look at this. Let me see where that is at. All right. This is a statistic speaking about deaths from military combat, from people who are on active duty that have been deployed. There have been, from 2006 to 2020, a total. And I want you to remember, during that time period, there were actually more people in the military than there are now. More people. And out of that 1/3 of 1%, that just over 1 million, there's only a certain percentage of those individuals that will see combat. Again, from a global empire and active real war zones where people are killing people and breaking their shit. Excuse the language. You had a total of approximately 17,000 active duty personnel which died during that duration. A duration between, again, 2006 and 2020. You had 17,000 people die. Among those deaths, only 20% was actually from live fire, killed in action due to their wounds or something that was sustained. You actually had more people kill themselves than they were that were killed by the enemy. Do you understand that there's more Black men that died within that time period from just straight up homicide than all of those numbers put together within 2 to 3 years? This is the military armed goddamn forces. There's more Black men that are being killed on some war bullshit than people whose job it is to kill people and break their stuff to defend national interest. There's no other demographic in this country that holds a candle to that number. None. I want to say something about Black women, because it should be noted that amongst every other group of people, the only other group of people that come close to us in death are Black women. And when we look at those stats for Black women, they cap out in the very beginning, the very, very beginning, at 15%, which is higher than everybody else, including white dudes, as we said before, who are only at 5%. Black women, 15%. That number drops to 8% when we get to 20 to 44, which is in line with everybody else. And it completely falls off by the time you get to 45, completely. What's interesting to note also is Black women have the lowest level of suicide amongst all demographics, period, bar none. So even though they have the highest suicide rate amongst women, they have the lowest suicide rates among everyone. Lowest. The absolute lowest. Something I really want people to consider. In contrast, you look at white women in this same category. Just look at white women right here. White women. White women. They are dying more so from random shit falling from the damn sky and suicide than anything else. But they need feminism. They are dying more from lifestyle choices and suicide than anything else. And we are dying at a rate that's higher than people who are actually in war right now. And we want to talk about respect and intrinsic value being something that has to be earned. Family, I want to introduce this idea of warrior culture because we literally are at war. We are, by definition of it. And nobody else in this country can say that. And it's due to a forced classification none of us chose. We're suffering the consequences of this irrespective of where you're at and what you're doing. And even if you manage to be an individual that's avoided a lot of these things, there's people you know who suffer from this daily. There's people you know, if you haven't been a direct recipient of that influence the aggregate with regards to this going down. If we don't ascribe that intrinsic value with regards to ourselves, if we don't do it, then who in the world else is going to? Because it's not affecting anybody else but us the same way. Even amongst the women that are right there adjacent to us, we still die at a rate 2 and 3 times higher than that. And we still die more when you factor in suicide. Family, we gotta become our own in-group. We don't really have an option. In this artificial environment, we can't afford to not see the intrinsic value in each other because nobody else really does in aggregate. Everybody expects us to function like a group because we've been assigned one. It's in the culture that we learn how to create these values. That's why I say, I encourage, I perpetuate this idea and understanding of this word, this concept, Osu no Seishin, Osu no Seishin, the spirit of Os. Among 10,000 meanings, expressing the willingness to strive against all odds, to preserve on the road to mental, physical, and spiritual strength, to respect one's seniors and responsibility to one's juniors. In a word, Os. It's not a game. It's not charading, it's something. It was during a time of warfare that these concepts were created. And whether you realize it or not, you are in a war currently, expressed mentally, physically, and spiritually. And in the face of this adversity, we have no choice but to literally endure, to literally persevere. Our hearts are being placed against the blade of modernization and reality. And as individuals, we have to cultivate enough force to make it. But if you can understand and recognize the intrinsic value of the person next to you, of the person that's literally in the same classification of you that has to endure the same thing, if you can recognize that and have the courage by cultivating the strength to endure and having the wisdom of how that works, the wisdom of what's going on around you to be informed, you can cultivate that compassion. And that's the fundamental way you cultivate trust. Because without that, you don't get a culture. You won't make it. Not as a group. And what comes for one will eventually come for you. They have waged war, and they are comfortable launching terrorism against us. And until we can see the inherent value in ourselves, other people will continue to treat us as we treat each other. It can only start and stop with us. And so in a word, I pass this flame to you, and please pass it to others around you that are in your immediate life that you come across when we're in this space. This space is our only dojo. It's the only place we have to cultivate that and amalgamate and speak so that we can strengthen each other. In a word, os, endure, persevere, continue to push forward. Become the leaders that can then go on and teach other leaders. You can do it. We do it anyway. We've had no choice. I'm just here to show you we never had a choice. This is our starting condition in a state of warfare. And literally nobody else can say the same thing. That Y chromosome marks you for usage of sacrifice, and the two entities that are interested in doing so, that are first and foremost and are the most vocal about it, is that damn gynocracy and white supremacy. It's not an admission of their being superior. It is an idea that they stand behind and believe, because they want to identify with this idea of whiteness and see it as a preeminent definition and dynamic of their existing as a human being and being human. And so long as human beings are human and they're going to follow into this arbitrary association, that's not going anywhere. And so long as that's the case, we are literally all we have. Recognize the intrinsic value in the one next to you, and understand that respect is not something earned. Intrinsic value is not something acquired through meritocracy. It is innate and inevitable by virtue of you being a living, breathing human being with sentience. That respect may be yours to lose, but you have it on an intrinsic level, on an intrinsic baseline level. It's always been that. And if we don't enforce that, nobody else will. That concludes the third portion that I wanted to get into. I can go into a lot more statistics and detail. I got all kind of resources, but I think what I'm going to do is probably fundamentally break that down into another topic when I get into the esoteric dynamic of this, specifically as it relates to sacrifice, as it relates to this idea of revisiting the third sword form when I talked about the demon gate and the definition of demonic entities as it relates to the way that behavior is played out and why we find ourselves in these positions and the motivation behind having us as this group that's constantly preyed upon, even though the narrative would make you think that we're these monsters that attack everyone and everything. We're not. We absolutely are not. But I'll go through some acknowledgments, and while I do that, I'll go ahead and drop the link in the chat and you guys can come up. We've got trolls now, since I guess we've reached a certain number threshold. I guess it's that time. They're showing up. So if you guys do have a wrench, please continue to do the same thing. Go ahead and cut these trolls off from the head and keep it pushing. So go ahead and scroll up. Let me get that link for you. And if you have any questions, go ahead and state it. And, we can chop it up on anything that we talked about today. see if I can. I've got some more acknowledgments here. Minimize some of these windows. All right, we got. All right, we got another cash app from Mr. Carroll. I appreciate you, family. Os. Thanks for that. Let's see, I think that's all I see for right now. Let me get into some of the newer folks that came in since we last checked that up. Let's see. I think we've got Gyogami came in. Os. Got Lindy sighting. Good to see you, family. Os. Jeff R showed up. Os. Mr. Coakley too. Os. Good to see you, fam. Let's see. Dan, I'm listening. Showed up. See you. Appreciate you. I'm glad you stopped by. Os. Don't think I've seen that name before, but Cree Pilgrim. Glad you could stop by. Os. Say, well, technology helps. It ain't like they're the mountain, and indeed. Indeed. Let's see. The liquor creep. And the result is annihilation. Os. And indeed, it absolutely is. That is the true motivation of racism. Because given the choice, the white women may unknowingly cause the power that the white male occupy the top spot. Yeah. I mean, I think feminism is an odd power move to try to do this weird role reversal where the women within that demographic want to be the new in-group males. Like, shout out to the island of Lesbos, man. That's a interesting history. We got Fitness Mom that came through. Definitely appreciate you for the Cash App. Os. We got BGS Ibmore. Definitely appreciate that. Os. Let's see. Broke Genius came by, man. Good to see you, family. Os. He says this is why men live lonely in the shadows. Ask a key survival strategy. Yeah, as a key survival strategy. Os. I'm going to be getting into that, like I said, with the concept of Muso Shugyo, the warrior pilgrimage in general. Almost done with these acknowledgments, and we will add folks on the panel. There we go. We'll start in order here. Ace, I don't think I've seen you before, have I?
No, this is the first time you and I spoken directly. I
Okay.
have seen your philosophy videos though.
Okay, I appreciate the support, fam. Let me get everybody up real quick. I just wanted to make sure you were legit because we got trolls in the chat now. But 1 second, stand by. Got Sandog here, Os. And Black Uru, Os. We'll go ahead in the order that we added you guys in. Again, thanks for coming up. But definitely, what's on your mind, Ace, man? Let's chop it up. What you got?
I may have missed a good chunk of this live stream, but I will assume the position that you were discussing the number of suicide rates as well as deaths black men have experienced and did firsthand, correct?
That was one component of it, yes.
I see. Therefore, confirming that this is literally a war zone for black men. May it be
Correct.
from other cultures that exhibit a severe level of hatred coming out of jealousy, or from even amongst those from the same culture, correct?
that is a component, and I explained that with social dominance order, and I expressed this in the idea that individuals in the adosocial complex don't identify themselves as being part of the same in group because this term black is a forced identification or a forced classification. And as a result, even though we've been assigned a group, we don't function as a group. And the end result of that is we see each other as being part of the out group. And part of the critical dynamics of the way that social dominance order works is that men that are in that out group classification are the disproportionate recipients of negativity and violence. So not only do we have the intergroup conflict, we also have the aggregated issue of seeing ourselves as outgroup men. In other words, we see each other as subordinate groups on a subconscious level. So when you get into the implicit bias and implicit association, there's also this component to not trust each other and see each other as the outsider or the dangerous other. And that compounds this result even furthermore, which again was an appeal to people to take the time to recognize that most of this is cultural and it does have a center of inertia that comes from the plantation. And a lot of my other videos have really used that as a front and center theme to address that.
I see. Very interesting. With that being said, though, thank you for taking the time to answer my questions, and I will watch many of the videos I have missed since it has been a while in terms of watching your content. Been preoccupied with other things.
Absolutely, fam, understandably. And definitely feel free to leave a comment if there's any content that you'd like. Just toss me an email. The My contact information should be in the description. So DMs are open, emails open. Definitely appreciate you, fam. Thanks for coming up.
You are welcome. Safe travels.
Okay, I think Sandog, you were next, family. What's good? Go ahead and drop your open, and then we'll go to Uru after that.
I think Black Uru came up before me. Did he?
Did I thought I brought you up first? Whoever wants it first. Again, I'll extend elder privilege the way Roger does. So Black Uru, if you want to get it before you forget, or something else you want to say, man, go ahead. It's all you.
Well, thanks for having me up, Nameless. I guess this is the first time I've ever been on the live on your channel, so it's an honor and a privilege to be able to visit you this way. And I appreciate the elder privilege extended by both you and Sand Dog, I guess, as well. So I appreciate that.
Of course, man.
Um, of course, there's no part at all of what you presented that I disagree with. And particularly emphasis on the creation of an in group, how of paramount importance that is. I agree. Um, I'm when I do the math or the calculus of that, I always am confronted with who gets the boys. So you don't really create an in group with men. You start the creation of an in group with boys, even as early as the infant stage, where it's clearly being communicated to you as a child that you are of a quote privileged stature amongst women or amongst other nationalities. Where you go, things you get to participate in, you're the white kids in the Boy Scouts. Ain't too many black kids in the Boy Scouts. You're the white kids who go to the good schools, you know, get this special training, get the if you're a baseball player, you get pitcher, train. You get these special privileges early in your life that clearly communicate that you're in that in group. And the absence of certain people communicate that they are in the out group. And so where I'm always, because I very much appreciate your introducing this concept of the establishment and in-group amongst Black men. I wholly agree with that. But I always feel like we're kind of in a situation where we're trying to fix things after the fact as Black men, after all or most of the damage has been done. And now we're struggling and trying to convince each other to be men in our own individual selves, then much less trying to also convince other men to align with each other. And even what will the criteria be? Who will set the standard for the in group? We're so fractious and so almost pathologically uh, disagreeable amongst each other that even establishing and maintaining the criteria of that in group, it would be a gargantuan task, to say the least. So I've said a number of things. Again, my biggest issue is as long as the white supremacist society, by way of the gynocracy, can essentially steal or kidnap the boys by way of the mothers, the formulation of an in group is going to be troubled at best.
And I concur with that, which is why the key factor here and why I even bothered doing the nameless word kata and speaking about these dynamics and rules of engagement and introducing the concept of dojo etiquette in this term, os, is because the fourth industrial wave is literally resetting everything. And the world is getting much smaller. What that means is the definition of American, if these folks don't figure this out within the next 5 to 10 years, this is already going to start to collapse and crumble with regards to this idea of what American means now. They're going to have to figure it out because they're in the process of getting left behind. In the meantime, there is a global conversation being had right now about what does it mean to be human? What it means to be human. And that conversation is quickly approaching, and very few people are ready to have that convo. From what I can see, and this is part of this idea of being on that warrior journey, what do we have to lose, Black Uru? What do we have to lose? Amongst all people on planet Earth, what do we have to lose? Truly lose as a group? Absolutely nothing. Especially if you have that Y chromosome. You have absolutely nothing to lose. And as a result, with this reset that's being put forward with fourth industrialism, we have an opportunity to gain initiative in this conversation with regards to being human, with the track record to demonstrate that not only have we persevered from some of the most difficult contexts and positions and circumstances that a human being can be placed under consistently and still somehow survive, that in the wake of all of that, when we're put forward towards the global conversation, if we have an opportunity to be seen as human first, we can thrive in ways that other groups of people have to at least confer through their culture first to find a measure of success. And if we can identify what those issues are from the onset by creating our own sort of in-group here online through this social environment, it's a stepping stone. And it's a stepping stone that can resonate because we didn't have the internet 30, 40 years ago like this. We didn't have the ability to very quickly disseminate ideas rapidly over vast distances like this. And it's about to get even easier to do when we get 5G, 4G modalities of technology that transfers information. Very soon, ideas are going to take the place of what military infrastructure used to. And it's the ideas that we can produce and act upon that are going to have their value and speak for themselves. If we can prepare for this new reset that's on the way and posture ourselves to engage in a global conversation, starting from perceiving our experience here as a dojo, as a training experience, as our muso shugyo, as a stopping point, our training arc as human beings, and assume our greater narrative in the context of where we stand in human history, not American history. then we can actually flip the script on this so hard in such a way that because our hands are empty, they're free to literally grab anything that we set our minds to. And I'm not selling hope on this. This is just fact. There's things that we can do with these technologies that are coming out that people couldn't even imagine. And right now, it's really up for the grabs of whoever can take it. As we speak right now, there's quantum computer programming that can be utilized for free, for example. The computing power of these things is so profound. There's whole infrastructures you can build on a cloud that will cost thousands of dollars to freaking do. All you need is an idea and a group of people to center and galvanize around it to make it happen. The amount of resources you would need, the bar of entry to that in the past was so high. Something like this could only be understood and imagined by the very top 1% of the 1%. Now the doors are about to fling wide open on so much of the stuff that these governments are scrambling to find talent and beg them to engage in it. That's the kind of world we're about to step into. So we've got multiple forces in play right now, which is why I'm not animated in the spirit of nihilism when I present these things. I just want people to understand what's on the way and how ill-prepared other groups of people are. Because the disadvantage of having your culture intact is that you have to go through your culture before you move. But the advantage of not being tied to any of that is no matter where you go, you're always in the outgroup. And if you're always going to have that outgroup tax, if you can provide value to the spheres of influence you enter into, you will be valued intrinsically because you're human, and then furthermore valued extrinsically to what you can add to what they already have. That makes us, by definition, the literal universal men. And that is the context under which I present all of these contexts. That is a pathway. That is an alternate path we can take as men with a Y chromosome and the adosocial complex that we are uniquely postured to take advantage of, that even women in our demographic have a harder time to be able to say. I think that's what sets the equilibrium with regards to that.
I definitely agree that being in the out group, at least, at this point as we exist, does give us certain flexibility with respect to the potential of adaptation towards whatever variety of circumstances we're in, because we're not locked down to some sort of cultural obligation of some sort of sociological obligation of sorts that other people are more inclined to be. It does give us some flexibility, but then it also, again, makes it difficult to create useful alliances amongst ourselves. Even like, we'll say this is a manosphere, but there are like significant differences of opinions and point of focus and emphasis, even in this relatively small group of varying degrees of enlightened men. There still are very much some sort of very fractious positions on certain things. For example, the issue of marriage, or the issue of who you mate with is a fractious issue amongst us. To what degree you are an American versus whether or not you should be a citizen of the world. The varying degrees of one's rebellion against the gynocracy. There are lots, even in this small group, there are some very sort of major points of difference that, as best I can tell, most people aren't necessarily ready to relent on. So when I think about the formulation of an in group, like any group, any organization, is going to or must, from as best I can tell, have some sort of hierarchy and some points of deference to some greater authority. You mentioned earlier, a group of male, female, old, young, out group, all those have different points of focus and emphasis and deference. And so I guess the question is, as you formulate the idea or the concept of an in-group, how do you get to that point of hierarchy and point of deference that, we could at least move to some direction in which we can all be somewhat, have some collectively beneficial approach to dealing with certain issues unique to being Black men?
I think I've talked to Sandog about this before. I think what needs to happen is something that's kind of already beginning to occur, where we need to establish a ceasefire to take that step and establish courage enough to say, okay, I have enough of an abundance of what I need, so I can afford to invest mutual belief and not perpetuating any and harboring any negativity with regards to devaluing another individual with a Y chromosome in my classification purely because I'm upset at them. In other words, to respect that intrinsic value within that individual and serve as an example of that. It has to start with that first step and being willing to be that example of it. From there, we have to take our own modalities of success, gain success in other spheres that are willing to see our extrinsic value, and then re-enter into this sphere once more with things to offer and demonstrate how they can get the same thing too. I think this is the way other groups of people had to figure it out. And I think this is how we're going to have to start from scratch to do it again, as well as in addition to that. I don't know any group of people that functions without a baseline level of being willing to operate altruistically when there's an understanding that they as a group are in trouble. I think when you look at the way other groups operate, even though they have their interpersonal conflicts, at the end of the day, when they're faced with extinction, they do come together. With regards to us, what we're going to have to do is disengage from this energy and re-engage with the new one. To start with the core fundamental ideology that we're willing to move forward with, and it can start with demonstrating basic courtesy and basic recognition of the intrinsic value of other people that are around you in the space. And I'm going to tell you right now, it works. People are going to have their differing opinions, but if we can make some measure of understanding and empathy and know when to disengage and leave it alone and just move on to the next topic and continue to move forward and start with the culture of showing our work with regards to, let me rephrase that, not so much show your work in that context, but to demonstrate a recognition that you can still acknowledge the humanity and baseline respect of another individual there. If we can start with that culture and reinforce that and just agree to just leave people alone who can't participate in that, folks will learn. And as we begin to share aspects that make us successful, we're going to see that success trickle off with other individuals around us. There are already people that are in this space who have been able to change their lives and make improvements off of just some of the information that's been shared by folks who are in the space. And as that begins to happen more often, there's a multiplicative effect with regards to that. There are a lot of collaborations, for example, that are happening behind closed doors that aren't necessarily being publicized yet, but we're seeing the results of that. Case in point, take a look at how quickly things escalated with KS. There's a lot of things he was getting done in the background that were about to get put front and center. And I'm pretty sure we're going to see some of those projects roll out piece by piece in the very near future in the next couple months here. But just that short amount of time, that much influence was able to be garnered. I mean, we can identify his metric, his scale of success as an anomaly, but when you look at us as a whole, there's still progress being made within those individual factions that are within the space. And I think we've got enough to navigate and move forward to have someone produce something and to create something tangible with regards to that. I mean, even Gigi right now is in the process of taking the steps required to get this documentary started. I don't think it's going to be too difficult for us to get the target goal we need for him to reach his financial goal for all of that. I think there's more that we can do, again, because of the era that we're in, that yes, we've got a lot to lose, but we equally have just as much that we can gain. What we need is momentum and timing. The timing is right to move. And it's not going to take a ton of us to get the momentum we need to get some measure of progress. We don't necessarily need everybody, but there's a lot an idea can do to change things and to begin that process. There's a lot of people who may catch what I said on the playback, and just from getting a scope and the concept of the numbers that we're talking about could be enough to snap some people into understanding how deep into the conditioning that they've been. If we understand that a majority of this behavior is in that allocortex, that limbic, that emotional autopilot that's going down, when just a fraction of that is being introduced to the prefrontal cortex and the conscious mind, you'd be surprised at how much of that changes behavior. I think we can have an effect. I think we can have an effect. We're just going to have to continue to do that and let time function. And honestly, at worst case scenario, even if it's just me, which it clearly isn't going to be, even if it's just me, I'd still do the same thing because I know it's affecting my immediate family. There's things that I've talked about where, I have my family members listening to my stream right now. I couldn't imagine this going down, 5-10 years ago. And we came from a lot of the textbook things we talked about. But because I've been able to bring a lot of these things forward and present idea, there's been a level of reconciliation and a modality of taking a step back, a reposturing and a reinterpretation of the current environment, and then action that can be done as a result that is effective and is making change. I can say, at least for me and my immediate family, I've made an impact. And they're also making an impact on other family members that are within my family that have been running on plantation gynometry on autopilot since they left Florida. So it does have a trickle down effect. And this technology is providing a modality for it to happen that really didn't exist before. And it's just going to get even greater as we get closer to the fourth industrial wave. But you can definitely hit the response on it. Let me know if I can elaborate on anything else. But I do want to get Sandog as an opening because I don't know if he has limited time because he's in a totally different time zone here.
What's up, Nameless? Os. Yeah, fam. So, again, when we talk about intrinsic value, there's another word that's significant to our experience in the United States that goes along with intrinsic value, which is civil, right? Civil rights movement. And what is it to be civil, right? To be civil is to be courteous, is to be polite, right? So you're talking about a society for both without and within, where internally we have not been civil, and externally we have not been civil. And so this, what's happening now is actually a chance to reassess or to reorganize what our priorities will be, as a community. Because when you're facing terrorism, so for example, I'm going to tell you what that guy did was he executed an actual military operation. So we now live in a day and an age where asymmetrical warfare is where it's at. So asymmetrical warfare is not traditional means of combat. That's guerrilla warfare. That's terrorism. And so before he did what he did at that shopping center, he conducted a recon. And so that shopping center, what am I trying to say? That shopping center, in military terms for him, was a named area of interest, right? This is something in reconnaissance where you visit or you go to a named area of interest to either confirm or deny what you believe about that place, right? So he identified entry and exit points. He identified the demographic of people that would be there, the time that they would be there, if they were armed or unarmed, right? And so again,
Yeah,
especially
he
the fact
described the
that
different munitions they were wearing and the types of armor that could counter it. He knew exactly what was going
he
on.
knew exactly. And so once he did his reconnaissance, it became a confirmed area of interest. And then what happened was he conducted an offensive operation called a raid, right? And so a raid, you're going in for the most part to like tear stuff up or capture somebody, right? And so this is what he knew, because again, it's like I said, he had a plan, because one of the main things you need before you conduct a raid is, one, you know how you getting in, but what's most important before you execute it is how you get out.
That exit strategy.
Yeah, so it's how you get out. And so again, so this was something, and so like I said, so like how you talked about how, because we don't have a martial culture, this is the language that's missing. So when you see like a lot of African Americans necessarily, or who may be media pundits who get on television and they talk about this with their other counterparts in society, fam, I'll tell you what, and like I said again, being a product of Brooklyn, New York, and Southern California, right? Gang members are not that surgical. Like I said,
Sad and most unfortunately.
not even, not even. I mean, unless something has changed. Again, it's been a while since I've been in those areas, but unless something has changed significantly, right? Gang members don't have that thought process or that level of planning. So everything in their world, for the most part, is reactionary, right? So everything is reactionary. Defending my turf, or whatever the case might be. So it's I don't. Yeah. So like I said, so these are the things that are not to be taken lightly. So this is what I wanted to come up and say, is that what you witnessed was an act of terror. And so what a lot of people don't understand is that, so for example, even within our community, and I heard SWP talk about firearms in regards to a deterrent to terrorism, and it isn't. So the fact that guy, so I'm not going to say it isn't, excuse me, not in and of it by itself. So the fact that guy had body armor, he wanted to manipulate the gun laws. He had a clear objective. And so at the end of the day, when these guys say that they're operating alone, it's not that they're operating alone. It's just that their command structure is decentralized, right? So again, remember before, if you go back in time, what did the Ku Klux Klan call itself? It called itself the Invisible Empire. So if you notice that every time one of these guys commits an attack, whether it be New Zealand or the United States, they're slowly but surely building upon the doctrine of one another and then claiming to be lone wolves. You know what I'm saying?
Or hiding behind different aspects of rank and authority, like the FBI had uncovered.
Exactly. So this is again. So exactly. So this, like I said, this is what I'm getting at. So now, when you're talking about asymmetrical warfare, like if me and Sergeant Willie P could have a conversation, the problem is, one, you would have to organize these communities in and of themselves, where you got a head count, any and everybody who lives there, exactly what they do, and you patrol the streets, and every time somebody foreign comes into that neighborhood, everybody turns heads.
Sounds like a checkpoint state.
Exactly.
So technically, it's what other groups do when they're patrolling. You go to Chinatown. That's pretty much what goes down, at least from what I've seen.
So you would have to have, so at the end of the day, you would have to have, again, like in a garrison state. So you would actually have to modify your community. So even in the military, before we execute any kind of operation, we have a staging area called an assembly area. And in an assembly area, that's what you have, right? You have and to establish an assembly area, you have something called priorities of work that need to be done. One is establishing sectors of fire. Again, if we're attacked from the assembly area, how do we split up? How do we meet back together? This will be called an objective rally point. And so there's so much stuff that goes into it. And so when you're talking about when you're talking about guns, because if you start carrying guns, for example, let's say these guys escalate to bombs or heavier or heavier firearms. So that's why I said, like, for me, I wish I could have a conversation with SWP, because again, you're talking about transforming your community, one, into a garrison, and then two, at that point, asymmetrical warfare. And asymmetrical warfare, information is your objective, right? And so now, like I said, everybody in the community, there's a head count. You know what I'm saying? When someone, and even to the point where you monitor people's social media, right?
Well, Sandog, here's the thing, and this is why I
but-
didn't want to digress too much, though, because you're right. But the point of this stream here that I was really trying to emphasize was we can't even get to that point if we don't recognize that we have an intrinsic responsibility to each other in that dynamic. If we don't have that, we won't get there.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm not. Yeah, and I agree with you 1,000%. But what I'm saying is that, so for example, you have a thing, right, in strategy called backwards planning, right? You're talking about where you want to be, right, and then where you are now, and then you go back, you go backwards, and you put it all together. So all I'm trying to articulate is how far behind you are in terms of dealing with these external threats, or this this terrorism. And that's all I'm saying. So I mean, so that's all I'm saying. So even to the point, so like, again, I'm not trying to digress far, but what I'm saying is that even to the point of knowing people's social media, what platforms they're on, like I said, monitoring it in terms of like what they share, observation of who they're affiliated with, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, it goes that deep. So all I'm saying, all I'm doing, Nameless, is trying to work backwards, right? So
No, I see you, because at the end of the day, ultimately you can't compare this to, quote, black on black crime.
Correct.
This was absolutely terrorism. They're not in the same classification. This is something deep and requires infrastructure and power to counteract. The term for that really is used in the modern era to address it is counterterrorism.
Yes,
we're not in a position to engage in that whatsoever.
Exactly. And so my thing is that, again, so what's been discussed in the manosphere back and forth up until this point, what's been discussed is actually pretty good as a deterrent for your local gangs. That's good. But when you talk about when you talk about dealing with acts of terror, simply having firearms, you will definitely be lacking. So that's all I'm trying to say. So, like, to your point and what to you and Black Uru was discussing, you're trying to figure out how to get everybody together, right? And then once you get everyone together, when you talk about that structure, right? So now you have a task organization, right? And so that's your structure. And then from there, you could put together an MTO, which is a mission table of organization and equipment, right? And people. And so in the discussion that I'm having, I'm just trying to follow up with you and Uru, and I'm just articulating certain concepts or things that we would need to do. And so, and coming back to you and Uru's point, is again setting aside those differences about how you're going to get there, because it's something that I said early when I first came to the sphere, is that, again, because we don't have a martial culture, we don't understand compartmentalization. So all of these stances that guys have that they're very passionate about, there is a place for it, but your stance is not the complete solution. So, for example, even in the Army itself, and I said it before, there's an infantry, there's an armor corps, which I belong to. We're in the subdivision cavalry. There's artillery. There's a signal corps. There's military intelligence, all the way down. So what happens is, no matter what your particular stance is, again, you have a place in finding a solution. So someone who's a quote unquote logistics or who's logistics officer, whose expertise is transportation, he may say, because of my knowledge of distribution networks and civil engineering, I have the complete solution. Another guy who's a signaleer may say, because of my knowledge of communications technology, I have the complete solution. When all of these things have to work in tandem, right? So your Hotep dudes,
Exactly.
your Hotep dudes, your business guys, your military guys, your your legal guys, like like Dennis Fred, whatever. All of this has to work in a tandem, because what a lot of people don't understand is that, again, amateurs deal in tactics, but the masters deal in logistics. You know what I'm saying? And so, like I said, so before we get into guns, and I'm not, look, again, I'm not saying that, but again, if you look at the Air Force, the Navy, or the Army, or any of them, the fighters are the minority.
And I don't
You know what
think
I'm saying?
people are used to that top-down understanding of what that looks like, which is why I got into the actual numbers of who really
Yeah.
consists numerically within these militaries. So
Yeah.
they can understand you don't need 20% of a population to be, even ideologically supporting something. You just need a small percentage that's willing to act on it. And
Correct.
that's what
But
gets things
even
done.
correct, and that's what I'm saying. And so even out of that million, or that small percentage, most of them are logisticians. Once you get into that, it's even a smaller percentage of actual trigger squeezers.
And see, that's why I wanted to really drive the point home about how many of us are dying violently. There are more of us dying violently as an individual demographic than people who are actually at war right now. And I
Yeah.
want that to really sink in, because nobody else in this country, in the developed first world, can say that. Not at the numbers we have. And if we're already losing the numbers, if we're already literally suffering the consequences from that, we literally have nothing to lose to at least see each other as human, to at least see the intrinsic value of each other, and recognize the position we're actually in the global conversation.
Yeah.
You,
But the
you guys
problem is,
remember the movie Friday, the first Friday movie?
yes.
There's a great scene in that movie. I'm sure I've mentioned this before, where Ice Cube's character, I guess they're having a problem. He and I forget Chris Tucker character, and Ice Cube character resorts to getting a gun, and his father sees him getting the gun and asking him, "Son, what are you doing with this gun?" Uh, and he said, "Well, we got a problem with this guy, or whatever." His father laments, "Man, I never would have brought us here. I thought you'd have to, my son would have to resort to having to shoot someone." And then at some point he tells him, he said, "The problem with you guys is you guys are punks, right? That, when I was coming up, you had a problem with somebody, uh, you handle it with your fist. Sometimes you win some, sometimes you lose some, but you live to fight another day." When I think about all the killings in Black communities, I don't think about poverty. I don't think about, how many guns there are or how easily guns are available. I think about, in too many cases, there isn't that father to have that conversation with his son. I think most of, the killings in Black communities are a dispute resolution issue. It's a pride or ego issue. It's too much female influence issue. Because a lot of these killings, I would say somewhere in the range of at least 30-40% of them, you got some females somewhere around, for sure. So when I think about the murder rate in particular, the violence of the murder rate, I mean, I remember, I'm 61 years old. I remember, you know, older male relatives organizing us in boxing matches and wrestling matches and whatever. You got a problem? Here's some Everlast. It's interesting. I would say in probably every other household when I was growing up as a kid, There were boxing gloves in those households. And probably every other household, I mean, it was a common kind of thing. You know, now I came up during Ali era or whatever, so boxing was king, right? So yeah, you got a problem with somebody, you put on some gloves, you work it out. And in most cases, after it was over, the respect level between you and the person you just fought with increases.
Indeed.
Because you respect the fact that you're willing to draw hands and to take some as well as give some out. And whatever's going on don't seem to, whatever happened that precipitated that fractious encounter don't seem to be as important after you boxed or after you wrestled and after the guys there pat you on the back, pat the guy on the back who lost, just as you pat the guy on the back of the guy who won. Well, you gave it your best, right? But y'all gonna be okay now. Let's put this shit behind us, and let's just go on from here. So I'm not saying poverty and those issues aren't certainly a part of what's going on. People being disaffected by lack of resources. I mean, obviously that's all a part of it. Although you could make an argument even that's a product of the fracturization of families. But I remember, and I'm just speaking mostly anecdotally here, obviously, but I remember men being there to handle disputes amongst us. I remember that. And I don't think you have as much of that now. In fact, I know you don't have as much of that now.
That's exactly what I was going to say, because ultimately what we're talking about is a lack of interpersonal relationship with regards to conflict resolution. And I try to make this axiom popular in the space every time we kind of have these conversations. And this is kind of what I'm talking about when I say this, that conflict absent of the spirit of trust creates destruction. But conflict in the presence of trust is a prerequisite, and in most instances, a requirement for conflict resolution or problem solving. That is absolutely what's missing, and you are critically spot on. Did you
But you
see
can't
me?
have trust without the authority to impose some criteria on all sides.
Right, and that's why I was going to ask you next about, did you catch what I said on BGS's panel yesterday when I broke down the Demon Gate, speaking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how that plays out in cultural coping mechanisms and
No,
what the
I
intersocial
regret I
context
didn't
is
make it
missing.
that far into what was a great stream. But no, if you want to recap, I'd appreciate it.
I will. Give me just a moment to pull the chart up, and I will get that so folks can see what I'm talking about. Let's see. Visit. There we go. Copy. Okay, I'm about to put a link in the chat here to what I'm talking about. So if you go to, let me see, can I put this up on my screen? Maybe I can. Let me try to do it this way. Let me make sure I'm on the stream first. Okay. I'm about to go here to the site. Let me know if you can see my screen here. How do I do that? Screen layout. Share screen. Close tooltip. Share. Share screen. Close tooltip. Okay, are you guys able to see this?
I don't see anything other than, oh, okay, it's coming up now. Just okay, yeah, I see it now.
All right, there we go. And you guys can see that clearly?
Yes.
Excellent. So here's what I was explaining with the nameless word kata 3, speaking about the demon gate. And what I said was this represents the bottom 4 dynamics here. The green, I guess that's a magenta, the red, and the blue. Those are core needs that human beings require in order to have a proper mechanism of coping with life in general. And as a result of that, if those needs aren't met by the culture, whose job it is to provide that generally at the home, then they will go about finding ways of denying that dynamic from others around them, or they'll find means of taking it from other people. So there are levels to this. I said a people recreate what it is they had from where they came from. So for the Edo social complex, our original point of cultural impetus was from the plantation. So if we look at this pyramid here and we investigate those bottom 2, physiological needs and safety needs, those were the 2 primary dynamics that we had utterly no control over. And I really want to emphasize the fact that we went over 200 plus years having no agency over acquiring these things. And so there are coping mechanisms that have to be in place to help you deal with that. And then as it pertains to these other 2, generally the religions that we had and the mindsets that we created to cope and deal with being in that position of captivity were what informed our modalities of coping so that we could get through with regards to that. So without a debriefing, all of those habits, all of those mechanisms of coping, all of those ideologies of getting by were inferred from that position, from that state of being in captivity for so damn long, that when we get out, we have an overemphasis on those bottom 2. So the idea of being raised properly in the Edo social complex revolves around, do you have a roof over your head and do you have food to eat? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes, that's classified as success. That is a baseline critical responsibility of a human being a parent to another human being. But that's seen as going above and beyond in our demographic because we have a cultural history of not being in control of those things.
Yeah.
When you compare that to other groups of people, it stands out like a sore thumb.
But
somebody was about to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like for Black Uru, just to touch on what he said, the missing word here, Black Uru, and what Nameless is pointing out as well, is patriarchy. Because remember, in the patriarchy, right? Again, this is where men. This is in the patriarchy. That's how tribes of men came together or that's how tribes either organized or how men came together to settle their disputes, right? And so, and the absence of that, for the most part, at least in our community, you will get a healthy population of rogue males.
But let me line this last point in here, because the point that Black Uru was also observing was the fact that in general, most of the conflict seems to stem again from the lack of being able to resolve conflict. And what I see are individuals not having their needs met within the red and the blue portions of this pyramid, because they are again classified as optional. Because the way we dealt with that was this leave it to Jesus pie in the sky dynamic while we were on the plantation. Well, clearly when we move beyond that into the modern era, we still have that pie in the sky nonsense, but ultimately there's no investment in making sure people have a sense of belonging, back to that intrinsic value. There's no investment or desire to see that your esteem needs are met, to know that the fact that you don't see yourself as being less than garbage, intrinsic value.
But who makes you feel who makes a male feel like he belongs more than his father?
Exactly.
Exactly. And that's what I was saying. The missing term, belonging and love, that's family. That's what I'm saying. This is what I'm talking. That's family, and then that's breakdown. So for example, you talk about belonging and love and esteem needs, right? So if you study my family history, right? If you study my family history, we all have been military and law enforcement, right? Military, law enforcement, logistics, and trade. So within my family, I have an identity, right? You know what I'm saying? And so that's what I'm saying. So when you talk about patriarchy, or the operative word is family, and that's what's missing.
And that remains. I'll go back to my concern when we were talking about the in group. That remains to me. Now, I don't know, or I cannot. I lack your insight, nameless, in terms of how the fourth industrial complex is going to affect things. I mean, all sort of weird dystopian thoughts come to my mind whenever I hear that
Shout
phrase,
out to the
frankly.
hive, right?
Yeah. So some of them quite delightful, some of them somewhat frightening, and some just kind of weird and odd. I go from everything to obviously the Matrix, to the Bruce Willis movie back in the 90s, with the Supreme Being, the female, which was, I guess, some very sort of weird feminist thing. I forget that movie. Um, but all kinds of thoughts come to mind. Obviously, the Fifth Element. Thank you, Gael Green. Fifth Element. Logan's Run, the Running Man. So all kinds of thoughts come to my mind in that regard. So forgive me for not being capable of being able to do much, make much of a worthwhile contribution in that regard. Uh, but so when I bring it back down to, I guess more modern, or not more modern, but more traditional level, man, woman, father, son, mother, daughter, that kind of thing. Um, I think about, how do you prepare to create that in group? Now, maybe like you say, it will be such that that in group can be created in a way that usurps the traditional way in which we advanced primates have mated and made families. I guess in some ways I'm hoping that is true. uh, but uh, in lieu of that, I would still be concerned about the effect of the current sociological infrastructure and legal infrastructure of this country in terms of its ability to interdict the formulation of an in group. Sandog was speaking of being a part of, or growing up as a part of, an in group by way of the profession of the men of his family, and it's a very strong and compelling thing, particularly if generation after generation after generation of men have been allowed, if you will, to pursue those career or vocational interests unimpeded by women, for example, or the society as a whole, which in some areas that could actually be the case. But to the extent that you all were able to focus in an accepted venue of formulating and maintaining your own sort of sub in group, you were able to do that. That's a different thing than, quote, black men forming a group, us having been so often a target of the destruction of any such interest in this country.
Well, that's why, again, we've got a lot of different paths people can take towards that. My goal right now is to communicate the image, or the information and the idea, to the people who will listen here. And from there, I think we've identified that the problem is the culture, number one. And in knowing that, what is inferring, or rather an aspect that the culture contributes to, and this is something we talked about in the second word, Kata, where I described environmental mastery. We stated that the environment is created from the superposition of civilization, and the culture. And the issue that we're facing in the environment currently is that the civilization is outpacing, due to technology, the speed at which the culture can generally respond. And as a result, there are ecological consequences that are playing out in the physical, the natural, and the social environments all throughout the world, but specifically here. So, with our particular issue, the environment is fundamentally our problem. So, what we need to do, likely, and for the majority of us to actually get any kind of grounding so that we can have some sort of chance to respond to this mess, is to remove ourselves from this immediate physical environment. In other words, concepts like SYSBM, retreating to other social environments such as this, need to be front and center, which is what we're doing, so that we can regroup and recognize our stance and our position and decide, at least as individuals, what's best for our particular situation. And inevitably, I believe that once we have a better stake at, or a better understanding of the combat theater, we can make appropriate responses and find others that do share a similar ideology to each other, whether it be on a micro or macro level, and at least act with regards to that. And I think a strategy for most of us, I can say that for Sandog, and I can also say it for myself, we probably need to go work with other social circles. And that's what I see happening. That's what I am and have been doing. That's what I see a lot of brothers doing here. I want to present this in another concept. And what I'll do, you know what, next week, I guess I'll talk about it. And I'll start with, again, this idea of the warrior pilgrimage, which ties into what I'm talking about with us being global citizens and not being necessarily so tied to this idea of us strictly being an American, but as having a place in human narrative so that we can participate in the global conversation. And even if we have to engage at a disadvantage where we don't have the same level of resources as other people directly, we can still get far greater ahead than where we would be at if we were doing the same thing in this environment as we stand. I think we can get a lot done just finding a proper environment and communicating with other folks who are doing the same thing. Sandog's doing it. We've got You Ain't Signing, for example, that's out there. And even if you don't link up with them directly, there's knowledge that they have on how they got started and resources available that we can tap into. We don't just have the United States as a plane of movement. We have so many different directions to go. Not all of us have to do it, but enough of us can, that can make a bigger difference from a higher place of leverage. And that's really where I'm at with that, to give us options to respond to the inevitable hit that we're going to take. I described it last night as, if we know we're going to have to take this direct hit to the jaw, that fraction of a second notice that it's going to happen can make the difference between you getting knocked out and you actually being able to relax enough to roll with the hit so that you can be postured to respond better, outside of just fighting, being knocked out from it, and then being helpless as a result.
Yeah. But, Nameless, like, and I would have to refer back to T.S. Johnson. So in terms of a black male body politic, again, the manosphere is the foundation of that. And again, a lot of the work that's being done, BGS, Uru, Art in the Stall, T.S. Johnson himself knew that language or that idea is being formed. So even if you look at Western society itself or many other societies, there were philosophical debates back and forth, right? Whether it be a senate, a parliament, or within some form of tribal government. So I think so. What I think is that, again, maybe within our lifetime, maybe not so. But, again, I think that the foundations of where we want to go or where we're looking to go is in the future is being built, starting in a space like this. So when you have things like, the octane levels by BGS or your sword forms, this is the beginning of the language being built for the philosophies that people of our background will be able to use in the future. So I would say just keep doing the work, just keep doing the work that we're doing. And, as it says in my fraternity, do thy duty that is best and leave it to the Lord the rest. And so, over time, uh, like I said, over time you'll see it. So right now we're just planting the tree, but just remember, you may not be around to enjoy the shade from that tree, but the work that we're doing here is the foundation for it. That inshallah that will grow into, and then that future generations could also use for their benefit.
Yeah, and that's pretty much where I'm at with it in general. I mean, I don't expect any sweeping changes. I'm not out here trying to be Jesus. It's just they're very simple things I see that can be done. And I appreciate the power of ritual and baseline behaviors that can be taken to dramatically improve at least your own situation. And if these things can be communicated, understanding the power of ideas, I think that's really the language of the future. That's the modality that will accomplish things in the future. And with the fourth industrial wave, those ideas are going to carry so much more weight to them and have much more oomph to be able to get things done, that I think we'll be surprised at the kind of foundations we can create. Because if nothing else, at least this provides some form of shade. And I'd rather have some form of shade when it's ridiculously burning hot in the middle of the damn desert than nothing. But I don't discard the fact that just having that difference of a few degrees could be the difference between so many folks making it and not. And the potential contribution that these individuals could make down the line is how you make gradual change eventually. It's how you take advantage of power over force. It's that measure of consistency over time. So that's why I think on a fundamental level, introducing dojo culture, introducing that concept of us, introducing some aspect of rules of engagement to put forward some measure of respect, some measure of, okay, at least here, we will recognize each other as human. We will engage with each other like warriors do. I think that serves again as a foundation to be able to use it elsewhere. And being able to observe something like that in action goes a long way in making change. And it's again, that's not on some, positivity preaching. It's just the way neurology works. It's through reinforcement. And if this is something that is within our ability, you know, I'm going to do it. And if I do it, someone else is eventually going to follow suit. So that's really my take on it. I think information goes a long way, and status reports are excellent tools for precursor to action.
So again, and like you said, that compartmentalization. And so, like I said, so you have someone like Black Uru who understands the ins and out of politics, what it takes to run for public office. Again, all these different things. And so, like I said, we're gonna have to get to the point when you talk about power, force multipliers, right? So we're gonna have to understand this. So again, so Sandal comes to the table understanding that, hey, the things that I operate on, be it Islam, military philosophy, certain types of business philosophy, that is part of the solution, but not the entire, like I said, not the entire solution itself. And we figure it out. So it's the same thing. So in the when I was in the, again, being I was a cavalry scout, a heavy scout, right? Do you know that it's the heavy scouts don't sneak and peek around like light scouts? Heavy scouts fight for information, right? So the offensive operation that I was always in was movement to contact, right? And so at the end of the day, you're moving, you punch somebody in the face, and then you're pretty much punching people in the face in order to get information, right? So that's a way. So some people do this and some people do that, and I really believe that's what we need to evolve to, and what will happen, especially a Black Uru. What I believe is that as we develop the language around the manosphere or the black male body politic, that things will become less divisive, right? So when I first came to the sphere, I came with the word conservative, right? So again, I lived outside of America for so many years or whatever. So for me, I'm looking at just the definition, the raw definition of the word. Whereas for you guys who are living in the States, the word conservatism, yeah, it has a dictionary definition, and it also has a context or on the ground definition. So I think that, again, as we continue to develop, as we evolve, as we make our own language, I think eventually we'll end up finding that we have more in common without using other forms or language or words that with the context of those words would trigger people. So yeah, so that's it from my side.
I know Rael just came up. Definitely want to make sure you get your opening statement in. And I guess we'll wind down after that. We've hit the 3-hour mark a minute ago, but yeah, just because we've been chopping it up with some heavy hitters in the space, I really wanted to make sure we kind of got some of these ideas out. And, this doesn't have to be the last time I bring this topic up. I mean, we're going to revisit it in different contexts, but I definitely wanted to get this information out there and kind of just share my subjective opinion on a lot of this stuff. Just because it's just been blowing me seeing just the lack of regard for human decency with regards towards our circumstance. And I don't know if people really see the kind of dire straits we're in and how casual people are about it. Folks are a little too comfortable with what's happening to us. And the fact that this is not happening to other people is a matter of it being systematic, but it's also an individual dynamic that we do have agency to address. And I wanted to highlight both of those simultaneously. It's not an either or, it's this and. But Rael, definitely go ahead, fam. I'm glad to see you up.
So nameless piece of the panel, piece of the chat. One of the things that I continuously say is that in order for you to move forward, you first have to figure out who you can't move forward with. That means you have to drop the dead weight. One of the things that I have continuously pushed in this space is the notion of Black male excellence as a form of elitism. And the reason why I push for it in that particular context is because when you start your standard at the level of elitism, by definition, there's going to be people who are just not going to be able to be a part of that process. Elitism is not about dragging folks along who don't want to come along. Elitism is about those who want to face the challenge, no matter how daunting it is, to realize the mission, to bring the mission to fruition. And so if being elevated in a monetary sense, in a political sense, is truly an aim of Black men, the bleeding heart stuff really has to go away. Because I remember when I was in middle school, and I remember playing ball with the 30, 40, and sometimes even 50-year-old Black men. And they did not take it easy on you. They didn't say, hey, you 12 years old, you're 13, we're going to take it easy on you. Nah, they bust your ass. And I remember my 7th grade year, going from my 7th grade year and 8th grade year, and the difference in my skill level playing basketball, it elevated tremendously. Why? Because I had older men who were not going to take it easy on me. They were going to give it to me as if I was their same age, but that made me a better player. And so when you look at the things that are facing black men. We've talked about this a couple of times. The name was, we talked about it last week as far as the fourth industrial complex. To me, I just think that this is the last opportunity for black men, ADOS black men.
I 100% agree. Definitely keep going with that combo.
We haven't had this level of freedom in America since post-Civil War, and the political environment that we had when we had the protection of the federal troops in the South. And so the beautiful thing about this particular situation is that there are so many white people who are just as fucked as black people are. So that means that they're starting at a base level, because no longer can you get away with whiteness advancing you. Those days are over with. I don't know if black people really understand that concept, but the days of white people just being able to advance in the corporate arena because they're white, it doesn't matter if they're white males or white women, those days are over with. And that's a great place for you to be in as a black man, post Civil War environment, which is one of the main reasons why Booker T. Washington set up Tuskegee. He understood the environment had moved to an industrial-based economy. And so he knew that black men being highly skilled, coming from the plantation experience, he knew that many of those men who wanted to advance their group economically were going to need to have those skill set that white people were going to pay for, that was going to allow them to advance monetarily and ultimately politically. A lot of people give Booker T. Washington a bad rap, but what Booker T was really focused on was the finances, because he knew that in order to really affect change in a positive way for his group, he knew black people were going to need money first. I mean, black people were basically a group of people with no money after being freed from slavery. So they needed money, they needed resources. And that's why he was so focused on it. He did also deal with things from a political perspective, but he did it in a much more he did it in a much more politically astute kind of way. He wasn't in white people's face antagonizing them. He just made certain moves in a more benign fashion that tended to work tended to work better for those particular times. So, but I just think this is the last hurrah. I really do. And if black men don't take advantage of this opportunity, because this is the freest black men have ever been. Like I've been saying this for a long time. Black men as a collective, productive black men, and even the men who are not productive, because if all you have to do is just shift your consciousness. And once you shift to a consciousness of productivity and you find your lane and you find your purpose, you're good. And so a lot, black men are, from in terms of the productive ones, they're basically like LeBron James was as a free agent in Cleveland his first time. I mean, the world is right there for the taking. And if it's a battle, like, nobody has to like you, nobody has to love you. I say this all the time, even when it comes to your relatives. There's a difference between somebody being related to you by blood and somebody who is actually your family. Just because your blood don't make you family. And if you know that you're a productive black man, you're capable of leading your family or the people you're related to in the right direction, and it's all this infighting, nobody wants to listen to you. man, I suggest, man, just completely excommunicating yourself from those people. That's what I propose, because you will expend a lot of energy. I've seen it. I'm still seeing it in terms of some of my friends from a high school perspective, still expending a lot of energy trying to save something that just needs to fall by the wayside. At this point, if everybody's going to be out for themselves, Black men need to be out for themselves as well. It needs to be Black male productivity first, Black male interest first, and be unapologetic about that. Anytime people come with the save the community type rhetoric, Black people stick together based on slavery and all that type of rhetoric, man, don't even waste your time listening to that crap, because it's literally people that's just trying to get you to come right back to the trick bag, trying to come back to the plantation, to keep working yourself to the bone and not getting anything in return. So at the end of the day, you know, Black men have to think about their own productivity, how to translate that into an elite position. In order to be in an elite position, obviously you can't be out here by yourself with no support system. Get you an elite group of men around you that are focused on whatever it is. I don't care if you want to do crypto, if you want to do real estate, if you want to get in banking, if you want to get in healthcare. I don't care what it is. And just hit that shit as hard as you possibly can. It's going to be a whole lot easier when you have a circle of men, because the beautiful thing about having a circle of men, a circle of brothers that you can work with, is that you don't have to know everything. That's the beauty of brotherhood. A lot of times people be out here thinking that they have to learn every single thing, stretching themselves so thin because they don't have a brotherhood to fall back on. If your brother over here knows how to do advertising, he's very skilled at that, you don't have to necessarily go read a book on advertising or try to get knowledge on that. You can lean on him and say, hey man, let's get this advertising. How do you think we need to set this up? And he'll show you, and you'll implement that and be successful at it. It's about delegating skill sets in a way that works for a collective body of men on the same accord. I was just talking to Complex Design recently, and I said basically productive Black men like ourselves, we're basically at a point where the so-called founding fathers were when they decided to set up this union. That's where we are. The productive men who want to move in a completely different direction. I'm not emotional about the so-called Black community, because I know enough about history to know people come and people go. But when you're in a position to actually expand yourself because the environment gives you the tools that can allow you to push forward in a positive way in terms of building family and building wealth, and you don't take those opportunities, I don't have the stomach nor the desire to hear any conversation about Black people need to get it together and Black people are suffering, because the tools are in the environment for you to do better.
Well, let me make it clear. It isn't that Black people are suffering, it's Black men are suffering. And that was one of the highlights I wanted to make and really emphasize the two things simultaneously. That one, you are by definition under attack, period. When you look at the data, when you look at everything that's there, you have an interest. And two, you're going to be charged for being a group, even if you don't cooperate. That leads to point number 3, that given this circumstance, you, one, not only have nothing to lose, you've got everything to gain. 4, the environment is rife for, due to the fourth industrial complex that's really coming in the industrial revolution, that's changing things up, to really get a foothold, to reposture yourself, to really gain leverage to change not only your life, but those around you and your immediate surroundings, which leads to number 5. You need to think globally and become a global citizen and understand where you stand in the global conversation, because America is going to be struggling with the demographic crisis very soon, where it needs to find homegrown talent to compete with other entities across the world. And it's falling behind because it's invested in this idea of race so deeply that it's alienating its own talent pool. And so it has to outsource that from other countries just to play catch up. And that is so cost inefficient. It's not even funny. So when we can see that there is a desire for competence, you can posture yourself with the skills, you can posture yourself with that sense of awareness, you can get out of being in that bubble, you can take advantage, you can make change in a way and in a context that we just generally have not seen before. We probably won't get another opportunity in decades, if not centuries, at the rate things are going.
I just want to. I was reading this book. I actually just finished on training and development, employee training and development, and these are just some of the numbers that people really need to wrap their heads around, just to give you an idea of truly the changes. It's not going to be that long. It says 6 out of 10 current occupations have more than 30% of work activities that can be automated using technology. By 2030, 15% of the global workforce, representing over 400 million workers, could be potentially displaced by the adoption of automation. 3%, 75 million workers. By 2030, up to 1/3 of the workforce in the United States and Germany, and nearly 50% of the workforce in Japan may need to learn new skills and find jobs in new occupation. From a training and development perspective, increases in automation mean that employees will need to be provided with job retraining at the national and company level to help them gain new skills and change careers if necessary. Education and training will need to address science, technology, engineering, and math, skills, and skills in leadership, soft skills, managing others, collaborative problem solving, social reasoning, creativity, and learning to learn. I've been banging the horn on this. Soft skills is becoming more valued in the workspace than hard skills. Many of the managers are complaining in the workforce that people are coming out of college lacking the proper soft skills to be able to work with their fellow employees in collaborative projects and work assignments. And so it goes on to say that companies will need to become even more involved in partnerships with educational institutions to provide certificate programs, apprenticeships, and on-the-job training needed for skill development. While employees are retraining, they will need some type of income and benefit support, and after retraining, they will need help in finding new jobs. The United States may have to consider implementing a large-scale education initiative like the GI Bill of 1944 to help employees reskill. Do y'all hear what we are saying here? That ain't saying black people. That's saying Americans are lacking the proper skills necessary to get the new form and new wave of jobs in this environment. For black men, that is a great place to be, because they are putting initiatives together where companies are partnering with the government, creating training programs where they're literally paying you, going through your training, and a job is waiting for you when you finish. And so this is why channels like the Black Brain Trust have been so vital in this space. but underutilized in this space. Because if you go into the history of the Black Brain Trust, you will see many of the things that the Black Brain Trust was saying in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020 are coming to fruition. They have laid out so many different articles and information showing the different types of jobs that are going to be available out here, that are available out here right now. And so many men in the space have not really taken advantage of the information that this space has brought to bear so Black men could be ready for the changes. There has been so much information that the Black Brain Trust has put out specifically regarding this particular issue that we should be jumping on immediately from a collective standpoint instead of the conversations that we've been having, because the female conversation, it has its place. But at the end of the day, man, if you ain't got no money, that really ain't gonna really matter at the end of the day. And so we really have to really have a space that really advances truly Black masculine thought, not just Black male thought, because there's a lot of Black males out here who ain't thinking properly. I'm talking about true masculine thought that deals with advancing a collective forward through the proper initiatives and missions that guide its purpose for coming together in the first place.
And like Sandog was mentioning earlier, again, having a social environment where you can have an opportunity to take state of your position and find potential folks you can aggregate that with and move forward with it all goes a long way as an initial first step. But since it's been going on to 4 hours now, I'm gonna go ahead and wind down, and this definitely will be. You said what?
I wasn't gonna keep you up here long. I just wanted.
Oh no, definitely appreciate that. And again, this is an ongoing conversation. We'll be revisiting this point, but we wanted to get started with just kind of really having a definitive understanding of why I try to push just really recognizing, folks' intrinsic value and baseline respect. Doesn't mean that, you need to be some kind of pushover, treat them like, with some sort of special treatment. Just the same respect you give yourself, give that to folks. You never know what they're going through. You see what we're going through. There's no need to perpetuate things that can be easily avoided and let go. And there's definitely alternatives. And if we can learn how to exercise some of those alternatives, I think we'll see much better results in preventing certain doors and bridges from shutting that could otherwise be left open and could be left to be profitable down the line for everyone. It's going to be a process, not happening overnight, but we got to acknowledge how far we've already come just to get to the starting point. I think that's enough to at least recognize that much, to sort of keep down, just to have good housekeeping rules. It makes cleaning up at the end of the week much easier to do. But with that said, I really appreciate you guys' cooperation. I appreciate the support. I appreciate the presence in the conversation. Definitely like and subscribe. And if you know some folks that can find some benefit, with the topics that were discussed here today, absolutely share with fam. I see you in the back chat. You'll just have to come back next time. I'll remember you. Definitely say something in the chat next time and we'll get you up whenever we do another panel. But no problem, C. But to the folks that are in the chat, the folks that contributed today, this has been the Nameless Protagonist. Enjoy the rest of your evening.